Ah, the Victorian dinner party invitation. A small piece of paper, capable of determining your entire social fate. It looks innocent. All cursive flourishes and heavy cream cardstock. But don't be fooled. This isn't just a dinner invitation. It's a duel, a social summons, a declaration of genteel warfare. The Victorian era was obsessed with class, status, and appearances, and nothing showcased this better than the simple act of who invited whom to eat questionable meat in a gas-lit dining room. Let's set the scene. You're a well-to-do Victorian gentleman or lady, or at least trying desperately to appear that way. One morning, as you're sipping your suspiciously grey tea, a butler arrives with a letter on a silver tray. You open it. It reads something like, Lady Throckmorton requests the pleasure of your company for dinner on Thursday the 17th at 7:30. Translation. You're being summoned to perform in the Olympic Games of Cutlery. Now this is not a casual invite. You can't just shrug and go nah. No. Declining a dinner invitation was the 19th century equivalent of throwing a brick through someone's parlor window while screaming that their soup was pedestrian. People talked, and once the gossips started fluttering their fans and whispering about how you snubbed Lady Throckmorton, your social standing began a slow, polite freefall into the abyss. Accepting, however, came with its own set of perils. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. First, there was RSVP etiquette, which wasn't just about saying yes or no. It had to be done immediately. No ghosting, no maybe. No, let me check my schedule. You didn't check your schedule because the invitation was your schedule now. A delayed reply suggested you were weighing your options, and that was borderline treason. Even the way you accepted mattered. A handwritten response, on similarly fine paper, had to be worded just right. Example, Miss Emily Hawthorne presents her compliments to Lady Throckmorton and will have the pleasure of accepting her kind invitation for Thursday next. Not, thanks for the invite. Sounds fun. I'm in. That would earn you an express ticket to the lowest tier of social Siberia, somewhere between owns only one waistcoat and laughs too loud. Then there's the unspoken meaning behind the invitation itself. Being invited meant you were either highly respected, politely tolerated because of your lineage, or the scandal du jour, and people wanted to see if you'd spontaneously combust during dessert. Your presence said something, so did your absence. This created an atmosphere of constant pressure and subtle psychological warfare. Victorian society thrived on these quiet acts of aggression. Declining a dinner party invite for any reason other than, I am dead, had to be accompanied by an avalanche of excuses and social lubrication. Even illness didn't get you off the hook easily. A headache? Suspicious? A cold? Questionable? Tuberculosis? Acceptable, but only if you promised to cough discreetly into your monogrammed handkerchief. If your family received 2 invitations for the same night from 2 different hosts of equal rank, congratulations. You are now trapped in a class-based moral dilemma. Choose one, and you risk offending the other. Try to go to both, and you're now sprinting across town in a horse-drawn cab while slowly being eaten alive by your corset. Try to get out of both, and everyone assumes you're secretly French. But heaven help you if you weren't invited at all. Not receiving an invitation was the worst fate imaginable. It meant you were either irrelevant, forgotten, or actively disliked. And if someone you considered your social equal hosted a dinner party and failed to send you an invite, it was basically the Victorian version of a subtweet. Except instead of being passive-aggressive online, they were passive-aggressive with expensive ink and a wax seal. Even more humiliating was receiving a last-minute invitation, because that meant someone else had cancelled, and you were the backup dancer in this rigid social ballet. The Victorian equivalent of, hey, our first pick couldn't make it. Want to come over for some aspic? Now, once you accepted, the real work began. You had to prepare your small talk, check the social rank of every other guest, review your family genealogy in case someone asked, and mentally rehearse your dinner etiquette like you were preparing to take the bar exam. You might even consult a manual like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, which included dinner table behavior, right next to instructions for boiling cow brains. Because at a Victorian dinner party, you weren't just eating, you were performing. Every move, every sentence, Every side glance across the table was a chance to impress or implode. It was a night of whispered judgments and internal panics, and all of it, every ounce of this high-stakes tension, started with that tiny innocent card. You are cordially invited. The good news? You were invited. The bad news? You now had to survive. Congratulations. You've said yes to the dinner party. That's the easy part. Now it's time for the real ordeal, getting dressed. You might think putting on clothes would be the least deadly part of the evening. But then again, this is the Victorian era, where style wasn't just fashion, it was combat. Let's start with the ladies, because Victorian women's wear wasn't so much an outfit as it was a high-stakes engineering project. First, you didn't just throw on a dress. Oh no, you had layers. And we're not talking tasteful fall aesthetics. We're talking full-body insulation. Your average dinner party get-up began with a camise. Think old-timey slip, followed by drawers, because modesty, then came petticoats, corsets, a bustle, maybe a crinoline cage, and finally the gown itself. That's not fashion, it's a wearable mausoleum. Now, let's talk about corsets, aka ribcage prisons. These stiff, laced-up garments were designed to crush your internal organs into a socially acceptable hourglass shape. The tighter the waist, the more refined you were considered. And if your lungs screamed for oxygen, too bad. Your outfit says elegant socialite, but your internal organs say we surrender. Many women would faint just walking from the front door to the drawing room. Not from excitement, but from the total lack of circulation. This wasn't seen as a medical emergency. It was seen as ladylike. You weren't fully dressed until your spleen filed a complaint. But corsets were just the beginning. The real showstopper was the crinoline, a massive bell-shaped cage made of steel, horsehair, or even whalebone. Its job was to hold your skirts out wide, really wide, so you could dominate the dinner party floor like a fabric tsunami. The downside? It made walking through doorways nearly impossible. Sitting was an act of advanced geometry, and God help you if you stood too close to a fireplace. Because yes, crinolines were flammable, and Victorian homes were full of open flames. Candles, gas lamps, fireplaces, all it took was one errant turn, or enthusiastic gesture, and whoosh. You went from belle of the ball to spontaneous combustion. There are actual historical records of women being burned alive at parties by their own fashionable flammability. It was tragic, horrifying, and somehow still considered preferable to being seen in last season's dress. Oh, and the dyes used in those dresses. Many were made with arsenic, especially the fashionable green hues. That's right. Your stunning emerald gown might be glowing because it's slowly killing you. Between the toxic fabric and the fire hazard, just getting dressed was like prepping for a chemistry experiment with live ammo. Meanwhile, the gentlemen didn't have it much easier. Men's dinner attire had to be precisely correct. Tailcoats, waistcoats, cravats, gloves, and the dreaded stiff collar. These collars weren't just decorative, they were often made of starched linen and shaped like mini guillotines, the kind that dug into your neck with every gulp of consommé. There's even a horrifying nickname for them. Father killers. Why? Because men occasionally died when the stiff collar cut off circulation or caused asphyxiation if they passed out drunk and collapsed at the wrong angle. The Victorian answer to this? Dress with dignity. Try not to pass out. Everything had a rule. Gloves had to be pristine. Shoes had to shine. If your pocket watch chain was too short, you looked cheap. If it was too long, you looked gaudy. If your lapels were the wrong width, you were practically a revolutionary. There were manuals for how to walk, sit, and even hold a teacup, because one wrong motion and someone might mistake you for nouveau riche. And in Victorian society, that was a fate worse than smallpox. The time investment. Getting dressed for a dinner party could take upwards of 3 hours. This included hairstyling, often done by a servant, perfuming to cover up the smell of your unwashed corset, and strategic makeup. Yes, even for men who might discreetly dab on powder to achieve that pale, aristocratic glow that said, "I've never done manual labor in my life." There were wardrobe consultants, maids, valets, and etiquette handbooks thicker than a Dickens novel, all to make sure you didn't turn up looking like a yokel. Even the timing of dressing was delicate. Show up too early, and you look desperate. Too late, and you're disrespectful. Just on time? Congratulations. You've survived the pre-party gauntlet. And remember, if you somehow didn't own an outfit fit for the occasion, you had two options. 1. Go into crushing debt and buy one. 2. Decline the invitation and immediately start the process of socially vanishing like a polite ghost. So yes, by the time you stepped out the door, gasping for breath, glowing with arsenic, and silently hoping your crinoline wouldn't burst into flames, you were technically ready, not comfortable, not safe, but ready. The good news, you looked fabulous. The bad news, you now had 6 more hours of sitting, smiling, and pretending your spleen didn't just fold in half. You've survived the invitation. You've somehow not asphyxiated yourself in a corset or exploded via crinoline. Congratulations. But don't sit comfortably yet, because now comes the most dangerous part of the Victorian dinner party, dining etiquette. This isn't just eating, it's performing with cutlery, rules, and social landmines at every turn. One misstep, and you won't just embarrass yourself. You'll be committing culinary heresy, punishable by gossip, exile from polite society, and perhaps even being seated next to someone middle class. Let's start with the basics. The place setting. At a formal Victorian dinner party, you might find yourself seated in front of what appears to be a silverware museum. There could be up to 17 separate utensils, each with a specific sacred purpose. There's a fork for fish, a fork for meat, a fork for salad, a fork for dessert, and at least one you're 90% sure is for either oyster removal or minor surgery. There's also an entire hierarchy of knives: butter, meat, fish, and that mysterious one with the curved blade that looks like it was stolen from a dentist's office. And don't forget the soup spoon, which is never the spoon you think it is. Oh no, the correct spoon is the one that looks least capable of handling soup. That's the rule. And if you're tempted to lean over and whisper, "Excuse me, which fork do I use first?" Don't. Asking for help is worse than stabbing the roast duck with your dessert fork and screaming. The only correct answer is, start from the outside and work your way in. But even then, you're gambling. If you use the asparagus tongs on the salad course, someone's monocle will fall into their consommé. Now let's talk napkins. These were not casual accessories. You weren't allowed to just toss it in your lap and call it a day. Napkin folding had rules. Some hosts had staff fold them into elaborate origami animals, or even symbolic shapes like swans, fans, or, yes, pyramids. Unfolding them incorrectly? Taboo. Using them before the host? Social suicide. Tucking them into your collar like a bib. You might as well commit tax fraud at the table. Oh, and don't you dare start eating before the host or hostess lifts their fork. You wait. You smile. You pretend you're not starving. Because starting too early brands you as uncivilized, while waiting too long makes you look confused. It's a performance, and everyone is watching. Then there's the conversation protocol. You couldn't just talk to anyone. The rules were: first course, speak to the person on your right. Second course, switch to your left. Third course, back to the right. Any deviation and you risked offending someone's entire bloodline. Talk across the table. How dare you? Speak out of turn. Expect a raised eyebrow so sharp it could slice your asparagus, which, by the way, you should never cut, only delicately nibble. And yes, let's talk about the asparagus situation. Victorians were obsessed with it, and yet somehow terrified of it. Proper asparagus handling was a litmus test for good breeding. Use a fork and knife? Barbaric. Pick it up with your fingers? Only if everyone else does it first. Your goal was to eat it, like it accidentally fell into your mouth while you weren't looking. Same goes for peas. The correct method? Gently squish them onto the back of your fork, using a small amount of mashed potato as glue. Yes, the back. Why? Because doing it the practical way, with a spoon, like a rational person, would mark you as a colonial. Water glasses were always above your knives. To the right. Wine glasses, arranged by size and shape like some sort of alchemical riddle. You never reached. You glided. You never clinked glasses. Too loud. Toasts were made with solemn nods, not drunken enthusiasm. In fact, having too much fun at dinner was a faux pas. Joy was permitted, but only in elegant microdoses. Dropping your cutlery? Shame. Accidentally touching someone else's spoon? Scandal. Using your bread to soak up gravy? War crime. And if you thought the host was forgiving? Think again. Victorian hosts trained like military generals. They studied etiquette books, attended hosting lectures, and sometimes even hired professional table coaches to stage manage the evening. The goal wasn't just to feed guests, It was to choreograph a 5-act ballet in which no one spilled sauce, and everyone knew exactly when to fake laugh. Speaking of faking things, if you disliked the food, you never said so. You smiled. You nodded. You pretended the lamb wasn't raw, the pudding wasn't made of glue, and the eels weren't staring at you. Expressing an opinion about taste was akin to expressing an opinion about the Queen's undergarments best left unspoken. And dessert. That came with more utensils. Fancy a trifle? There's a trifle spoon. Want some fruit? You'll need the fruit knife and fork because peeling an orange with your hands was considered one step above biting someone in the drawing room. In conclusion, dining at a Victorian dinner party wasn't about eating. It was about not dying of embarrassment. The food was incidental. The real menu was fear, formality, and a soup course that you dared not slurp. The good news, you didn't spill anything. The bad news, you've just spent 2 hours clenching your glutes and pretending to understand the difference between the game pie knife and the pastry trowel. Congratulations, you've RSVP correctly, survived the fashion gauntlet without combusting, and somehow navigated the etiquette maze without mistaking a shrimp fork for a dental implement. Now comes the next horror. The food. Victorian dinner parties weren't meals. They were endurance tests with garnish. A single evening's menu could consist of 8 to 14 courses, not including palate cleansers, after-dinner sweets, or the strong desire to run into the woods and live among the badgers. This wasn't some cozy potluck with your pals. Oh no, this was a marathon of meats, mysterious gels, and more French words than a Parisian cookbook being used as a doorstop. The Victorian dinner menu was a symbol of class, wealth, and utter digestive insanity. The more elaborate the meal, the more elite the host appeared. Your stomach was simply collateral damage. Let's start at the top. First course, the soup ambush. You're eased into the evening with soup. Sounds safe, right? Except Victorian soup was less comforting broth and more liquid threat. Popular choices included mock turtle soup, made from calf's head, not a turtle. It only pretended to be turtle, like some kind of gelatinous con artist, and oxtail consommé, which was essentially cowtail tea, served with a sprinkle of societal pressure. Eat slowly, not because you're savoring it, because you still have 13 courses to go. Second course, fish, or which bones will betray you tonight. Up next, fish. Think trout, sole, or salmon, often poached, smothered in questionable sauces, and decorated like a Victorian dollhouse. Fish was a trap. One wrong slice, and you're spitting bones into your linen napkin while praying no one notices. Bonus round, fish custard. Yes, that was real. No, you may not emotionally recover. Third course, remove the fish, replace with face. Removes were the transitional courses. They usually involved large, dramatic meats, roast goose, haunch of venison, or stuffed calf's head, which stares at you with the cold, lifeless gaze of your lost appetite, and you can't not eat it. Declining would offend the host, who probably imported the calf's head from a duchess's farm and had it arranged by a food stylist who hates joy. Fourth course, entrees, not what you think they are. Here's where things get confusing. Entree didn't mean main course in Victorian English. It meant a delicate interlude of horrors. This might include lamb tongues in aspic, pigeon pie with decorative feathers, or sweetbreads, which, if you're unfamiliar, are not sweet or bread. They are animal glands in disguise. Each dish was intricately shaped, molded, or, if the cook had flair, set in a wobbly dome of gelatin. If it jiggled, it was either dessert or a very confident meat. Fifth course, game time, literally. Next up, game meats. These were the aristocracy's way of reminding you that they could shoot things and then feed them to you in the fanciest way possible. Partridge, pheasant, wild duck, rabbit, hare pie, you name it. If it once frolicked through a meadow, it was now on your plate, under sauce, and probably stuffed with oysters. And let's not forget, lark's tongue pie, made from actual larks. That's right, Victorians were out here chasing birds the size of a thumb to serve 40 of their tongues in a crust. Because why not? Sixth course, the ghost of cheese and salads. Now we cleanse the palate with cheese salad and vague regret. Salads weren't what you're picturing, no Caesar dressing or croutons here. These were exotic piles of celery in vinegar, cold potatoes in aspic, or lettuce topped with ornamental radishes carved to resemble roses. They looked nice, but tasted like garden sadness. Cheese was served in small amounts, as if to whisper, Here's a bit of normal. Don't get used to it. Seventh course, dessert or death? Ah, dessert. The part you were waiting for, until you realize dessert is the weirdest course yet. You might see cabinet pudding, a steamed sponge, stuffed with dried fruits and custard, or Charlotte Russe, made of cake, cream and structural confusion. Perhaps a gelatin sculpture, tinted green with arsenic-based dye. Yes, arsenic makes the color pop, also your lungs. Jellied fruit, blancmange, suet puddings. The Victorians loved to set everything in gelatin, as if their culinary goal was to petrify joy. Final course, fruit and finger bowls of despair. To close, a light offering of fruit and nuts. Except these weren't just any fruits, they were exotic imports. Pineapples, dates, figs, oranges. Displayed like the crown jewels, you were expected to peel your orange with a knife and fork while making pleasant conversation, and pretending your corset wasn't slowly turning your spine into a question mark. And of course, finger bowls were passed around, because nothing says refinement like dipping your greasy fingertips in a tiny glass pool of lemon water, while making eye contact with your social rival. The rules. You had to eat it all. Here's the real kicker. Even if you hated it, you ate it. Clean plates were a sign of respect. Leaving food meant you were ungrateful, ill-bred, or possibly French. So yes, you smiled through the jellied eel, pretended to adore the boiled cow face, and swallowed the glowing green pudding like it wasn't clearly a biohazard. Because you didn't come to enjoy food, you came to perform gastronomic survival. Welcome to the Victorian dinner party, where you've survived the social games, corset compression, and enough pigeon pie to ground a small flock. But now it's time for the real danger. The food itself is trying to kill you. Because in Victorian England, it wasn't enough that meals looked terrifying and smelled like a chemistry experiment conducted in a barn. No, they were also literally laced with poison. Not metaphorically, not poetically, chemically. Let's start with arsenic, the darling of the Victorian pantry. If your pantry was also your murder kit, arsenic was used in everything from rat poison to wallpaper. But the real twist, it was in your food too, especially in desserts. Why? Because arsenic created a gorgeous, vibrant green when used as a food dye. Enter emerald sweets, those lovely green bonbons handed to children, guests, and possibly your enemies. They weren't lime-flavored, they were grim-flavored. The Victorians were obsessed with color. A dull cake was embarrassing. A brilliant green one, très chic. Until, of course, the guests began vomiting or went into convulsions. But hey, at least it matched the drapes. And before you judge too harshly, remember food labeling laws didn't exist. Natural flavors could mean anything from vanilla bean to powdered antimony. It was the edible equivalent of Russian roulette, but with more garnish. Want a glass of wine to wash down your arsenic cake? Lovely. Just know that your Victorian claret may have been sweetened with lead acetate. Why would someone do that? Because lead gave the wine a smoother mouthfeel and helped preserve it. Think of it as the 19th century version of MSG, except instead of enhancing flavor, it enhanced death. Lead poisoning was widespread, especially among the upper class who drank imported wines, but it was blamed on vague things like bad humors, vapors, or being overly French. The real cause, lead-laced luxury. Cheers. Even your humble breakfast toast wasn't safe. Victorian butter was often freshened with borax, a household cleaning product that's great at keeping mold away and also your digestive lining. The thinking went, butter spoils, borax doesn't. So why not combine the two? Result, a substance that could survive a nuclear winter and possibly create one in your gut. If you were fancy, you might also encounter butter dyed with lead chromate, a bright yellow pigment used to make things look extra creamy. Rich, golden butter might literally glow with a radioactive hue, and not metaphorically. Great for impressing guests, less great for staying alive. Think pickles are safe? Think again. Victorian grocers often added copper sulfate to pickles to make them look crisp, bright green, and fresh. Unfortunately, copper sulfate is a fungicide and a powerful emetic. Yes, it'll keep mold away. It'll also make you see God while clutching the chamber pot. Still, dull pickles were considered vulgar. If your gherkin didn't glow like it had been raised near a uranium mine, what were you even doing with your life? Let's say you wanted some bread with your meal. Innocent enough. Until you realized that Victorian bakers often added alum to whiten bread, chalk to bulk it out, and even plaster of Paris for texture. You read that right. Your daily loaf might double as interior drywall. Even milk wasn't safe. Vendors watered it down to maximize profit, then added starch or flour to make it look thick again. Some particularly bold scammers even mixed in calf brains to give it a more authentic texture. Yes, brainy milk. Victorian food wasn't farm to table. It was Frankenstein to teacup. Let's take a horrifying detour into the sweets shop, because nothing says childhood delight like poisoned lollipops. Sweets were often bulked up with chalk, powdered glass, or even red lid to enhance the color. This meant a trip to the confectioner was kind of like gambling, except the prize might be organ failure. In one famous 1858 incident in Bradford, England, 20 people died after eating peppermint humbugs that had been accidentally laced with arsenic instead of sugar. Why? A chemist's assistant got the barrels mixed up. Let that sink in. Oops, wrong barrel. Guess it's a mass poisoning today. Victorian quality control, where being alive after dessert was the ultimate Yelp review. What's even more shocking is how long this went on. Food poisoning deaths were often chalked up to bad digestion or miasma, the infamous Victorian term for we don't know, but it smells funny. There was no FDA, no ingredient list, and certainly no panic about allergens, unless you count arsenic as an allergen, which, fair. It wasn't until the late 19th century that public outcry and a few too many fatalities at fancy dinners pushed Parliament to start regulating food safety. The Food Adulteration Acts of the 1870s were the first baby steps toward not poisoning your guests as a dinner party tradition. So yes, attending a Victorian dinner party wasn't just about eating weird things. It was about risking your life in a culinary minefield of dye, deceit, and delightful presentation. You weren't just a guest. You were a volunteer test subject in a gourmet chemistry lab run by someone's butler. If your host didn't kill you with a calf's head entree, the glowing green trifle might finish the job, but at least you died fashionably, probably while holding a dessert fork and making polite conversation. So you've survived the dress code, navigated the etiquette minefield, and even managed to not perish from toxic trifle. Congratulations, but don't get too comfortable, because you've now entered the final boss level of the Victorian dinner party. The dining room itself. Yes, the decor is exquisite. The chandeliers sparkle, the drapes are sumptuous, the wallpaper is actively trying to kill you. Welcome to a world where your host's impeccable taste might come with a side of lung collapse. Because in the Victorian era, the most dangerous thing at the table wasn't always on the plate. It was the room you were eating in. Victorians loved wallpaper. Plain walls were for peasants and hospitals. Real socialites covered every inch in intricate, colourful patterns. But what made those colours so vibrant? Arsenic. Yes, that same arsenic from Chapter 5 also found a cosy home in wallpaper dye. The most infamous shade, a rich, verdant colour called Shields green, later known as Paris green, which might as well have been called silent death moss. This wasn't just a design flaw. It was a public health disaster wrapped in elegance. The arsenic didn't just sit there. Under the right humid conditions, it released poisonous vapors. Imagine having a lovely dinner while slowly inhaling your own autopsy report. In one case, a child died simply from sleeping in a room with green wallpaper. In another, people reported hallucinations, nausea, and hair loss after just a few hours of sitting in a parlor. But hey, at least the shade complemented the china. And if you dared to complain, you were considered, brace yourself, unfashionable. Next, let's talk ambiance. The warm, romantic glow of Victorian dinner parties didn't come from LED bulbs or Edison bulbs, or even oil lamps. No, it came from gas lighting, piped directly into homes. And you know what you get when you mix open flames with a room full of heavy drapery, dry floral arrangements, paper fans, lace, tulle, and flammable hair oils. A recipe for spontaneous, aristocratic combustion. Gas lights weren't exactly subtle. They hissed, flickered, and leaked like a steampunk death rattle. If improperly vented, which they often were, they filled rooms with carbon monoxide, a gas so undetectable and dangerous, it made arsenic look like a vitamin supplement. So picture this, you're 3 courses in, trying to cut through pigeon mousse, when a gas light hisses too close to the curtain. Suddenly, Aunt Agatha is on fire. and the footman's using the soufflé dish as an emergency extinguisher. Dinner and a show, except the show is gone in a flash. The lady whose petticoat lit up like a tinderbox. Let's move on to the centerpiece. A stunning arrangement of hydrangeas, lilies, and possibly your respiratory demise. In Victorian society, floral arrangements weren't just decorative, they were symbolic. Hydrangeas for vanity, lilies for purity, foxglove for, oh, wait, deadly cardiac poison. Yes, some bouquets came with lethal side effects. The Victorians also loved pressed flowers, soaked in preserving chemicals like formaldehyde and mercury solutions. These would be artfully arranged around the table, often inches from your food, because nothing says bon appetit like eating next to a neurotoxin bouquet. And then there were the perfumes. Since many of the floral decorations started to smell real funky after a few hours, people spritzed them with strong synthetic fragrances, often based in ammonia or camphor. So now you're inhaling industrial-strength perfume, arsenic off-gassing, and the slow hiss of the gaslight. Delicious. By the way, let's not forget that the room's warm glow and flower buffet also invited insects, like it was an open mic night at the Fly Club. Insects weren't just annoying, they could ruin everything. Moths dived into soups, beetles crawled across silver platters, even fleas showed up uninvited, clinging to the velvet upholstery with the same determination as a debutante securing a duke. Victorians didn't exactly have raid. Instead, they'd often burn camphor blocks, tar balls, or place toxic flypaper under the table. Some hosts would even hang small sachets of insecticidal herbs in the chandeliers, and if a guest accidentally inhaled one during a dramatic toast, well, that's why they kept smelling salts nearby. Let's take a deep breath, if you dare. Victorian dining rooms were often windowless, thickly curtained, and designed to be as insulated as possible to preserve heat. The result? An enclosed chamber, where 10 people, 2 gaslights, and a soup tureen full of fumes slowly stewed in their own oxygen-deprived funk. Between the tobacco smoke, yes, cigars at the table were a thing, the gas emissions, the perfume, and whatever your host's dog was doing under the table. Air quality was somewhere between London fog and volcanic cave, and if someone fainted during dinner, totally normal. Just pass them a fan and resume slicing your jellied tongue. In the Victorian world, aesthetics were everything, even if those aesthetics came with a body count. Your host didn't mean to gas you, poison you, or set the curtains on fire. They just wanted to impress. But that was the twisted beauty of the Victorian dinner party. You risked your life, not for food, not for fun, but for fashionable death by centerpiece. And as you stumbled out at midnight, high on lead fumes and chamomile liqueur, clutching your lace handkerchief and possibly a lung, you didn't complain. You simply said, "What a lovely evening," because to admit otherwise would be gauche. Now let's talk about the lower class copycat dinner disaster. How the middle class tried and failed to copy upper class dining. So you're not rich, you don't have a Duchess grandmother or a 6-bedroom townhouse in Mayfair. You are, at best, middle class. You work for a living, or worse, your husband does. But does that stop you from wanting the glamour of a high society dinner party? Absolutely not. You want the chandeliers, the 12-course menu, the embroidered napkins, the butler, who glides, not walks. But you have a small dining room, 3 forks total, and your butler is named Harold, and he works part-time at the haberdashery. Still, you try. This is the story of what happened when the Victorian middle class decided to cosplay the aristocracy. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. It went somewhere between financial collapse and emergency liver evacuation. The Industrial Revolution created an entirely new social group, people with some money and a lot of aspirations. They didn't come from titles or estates, but from coal, textiles, railroads, or banking. They were the nouveau riche of the Victorian age, and they were absolutely desperate to fit in with the landed gentry. And what better way to prove you were one of them than hosting an over-the-top dinner party? The problem? Real aristocrats had inherited wealth, servants, silverware, and centuries of etiquette oozing from their marble staircases. The middle class had mail-order catalogues, etiquette manuals, and a deeply misplaced sense of confidence. Let's talk cutlery. Upper-class tables gleamed with sterling silver utensils, each piece meticulously placed by servants trained in the sacred geometry of place settings. The middle class had electroplated nickel. That's right, to impress guests, middle-class families bought plated cutlery. It looked like silver, felt like silver, and if you squinted, even pretended to smell like silver. But after one enthusiastic scrub or an especially acidic soup, the silver coating would peel like sunburn, revealing the dull shame of base metal underneath. Even worse, some families couldn't afford even that, so they would rent silverware. Yes, rented. For one night only, your guests would believe you were the kind of person who buttered your bread with 925 sterling. Just don't let them see your actual kitchen, or the receipt. Since most aspiring socialites didn't grow up eating swan aspic and gesturing with pinkies, they turned to the booming world of self-help books. Victorian etiquette manuals exploded in popularity, offering crucial advice such as never drink soup from the side of your spoon like a common miner, bow precisely 17 degrees when introduced to a clergyman. If someone dies at your table, ring for the second footman and continue serving. Armed with these tomes, middle-class hosts practiced their curtsies in the mirror, timed their courses by candle height, and wrote down witty dinner banter in case the conversation veered away from horses or the Queen. Unfortunately, real-life application was a mess. Nothing screams not upper class like flipping through Mrs. Beeton's guide to being less awkward mid-meal to figure out which of your 4 rented forks is for the pickled walnut course. Middle-class families also tried to imitate aristocratic cuisine, often with deadly consequences. Couldn't afford authentic French wine? Buy a cheap domestic one and tint it with lead acetate to make it look rich and red. Out of real butter? No problem. Use borax to make your margarine glisten like gold. Want that fancy green color for your petit pois? Add some copper sulfate and a prayer. Middle-class kitchens became toxic laboratories of aspiration. Recipes were copied from upper-class cookbooks without understanding the ingredients or the techniques. The result? Disasters ranging from inedible to chemical hazard with garnishes. People got sick, some even died, but at least the table looked stunning. And wasn't that the point? Middle-class dinner parties were more theatre than hospitality. The goal wasn't to enjoy the food or relax. It was to convince your guests that you were £5 richer and 3 generations more respectable than you actually were. Hosts would sometimes go into debt for these dinners. They bought imitation china, rented carriages, hired temporary servants, and filled parlours with borrowed furniture just to maintain the illusion for one night. Guests did their part too. They'd arrive overdressed, recite memorized small talk, and pretend not to notice that the footman was actually the neighbour's teenage son in a borrowed waistcoat. Of course, the system eventually buckled under its own starched collar. Trying to live like the elite on a clerk's salary caused massive anxiety, debt, and social embarrassment. One wrong fork, one visible tin plate, or one unfortunate dining-induced hallucination from arsenic-laced blancmange, and the entire illusion came crashing down. Worse still, the very people they tried to imitate, the actual upper class, saw right through it. They mocked the efforts, sniffed at the decor, and used phrases like positively bourgeois with the same tone you'd use for a flat tire or a wet dog in the drawing room. So what did the lower classes get for their trouble? Questionable soup, mountains of debt, one evening of pretending they were the Earl of Fancyshire, and the lingering taste of copper-laced trout, aspic, all in pursuit of the illusion of nobility. So next time you see a glittering dinner table in a costume drama and think, oh how charming, remember, someone may have mortgaged their house to impress a dentist. You wanted elegance. You got salmonella in a cravat. Imagine you've just endured 11 courses of jellied nightmare fuel and managed to survive a salad fork gauntlet without misplacing your pinky. You're bloated, confused, and deeply afraid of whatever that last thing was. It jiggled and mooed. You lean back in your uncomfortable mahogany chair, ready for dessert, only to realize that tonight's post-dinner treat is a portal to the spirit realm. Welcome to Victorian dinner entertainment, where the soufflé isn't the only thing rising unexpectedly. Dinner parties in the Victorian era weren't just about showing off your china or poisoning guests with food-grade arsenic. No, the truly fashionable host had one more trick up their lace-trimmed sleeve entertainment. But not just any entertainment. This wasn't a round of charades or a polite piano solo. This was, let's invite a ghost to dessert. Levels of weird. Victorian society was obsessed with the spiritual. In an era of industrial machines and strict religious codes, People were just dying. Pun firmly intended for a little magic in their lives. And what better place to summon the beyond than after digesting a suspiciously green dessert? Hence, seances, fortune-telling, and parlor tricks became the Netflix and chill of their time, minus the streaming, and with more ectoplasm. Let's start with the seance. Usually led by a medium, someone with just enough charisma and ringed fingers to pass for a psychic. These events often included candlelight, whispered incantations, and a generous helping of dramatic sighing. Guests would sit around the table, hold hands, which was probably scandalous and unsanitary, and wait for contact. Contact could mean a few things. Sometimes the table levitated. Sometimes it tapped out answers to questions. Sometimes Aunt Millicent swore she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, but that might have just been Jenkins, the footman adjusting the gaslight. Either way, someone always gasped, someone always fainted, and everyone left feeling like something profoundly spiritual or gastrointestinal had just occurred. If summoning the dead felt a little too intense, there was always table turning, a pastime where you lightly placed your fingers on the table and waited for it to spin, rock, or knock in response to yes or no questions. The table might answer, or it might do nothing, depending on whether the spirit world had decent reception that night. Of course, if the table responded too enthusiastically, everyone just blamed poor Harold for pushing, not into ghosts. No problem. Victorians also loved phrenology, the pseudo-scientific art of measuring the bumps on your skull to reveal your personality. Dinner guests could take turns fondling each other's craniums, while an expert declared that Mrs. Danvers had an overdeveloped bump of cruelty, or that Mr. Pritchard was clearly destined for accounting. It was like a BuzzFeed quiz for your forehead, but with more wigs and judgment. Another crowd favourite was fortune-telling. This could be done with cards, tea leaves, or even roasted chestnuts, because why not? A skilled reader might peer into the swirls of your leftover Earl Grey and declare you were destined for great love or an unfortunate trip down a flight of stairs. Either way, it made for excellent gossip and the occasional duel. And of course, there was always music. But don't imagine a quiet harp in the corner. Picture instead your host's niece, who's just completed her second year of piano expression, dramatically pounding out Chopin with the confidence of someone who's never practiced in her life, or a solo violinist so deeply into their performance that they forget half the room is sobbing into their syllabub, unsure if it's from emotion or inner ear damage. Then there were dramatic readings, a classic choice for showing off your theatrical flair. A guest, usually the loudest one, would rise from their chair, clutch a book of poetry to their heaving bosom, and deliver Tennyson or Byron with such fervour that the potted ferns trembled. If you were lucky, the reading would stop before someone tried to do Shakespeare in character after 4 glasses of sherry. And finally, we must discuss the magic tricks. Every good host either hired a magician or had that one eccentric cousin who insisted on pulling coins from people's ears. Illusions ranged from card tricks to making a silk handkerchief disappear in a puff of slightly alarming smoke. Sometimes it was charming. Sometimes the fire brigade had to be called. Either way, you remembered it. These post-dinner activities were more than just diversions. They were social chess games. Being too skeptical about the ghost, you risked being labelled a cold-hearted cynic. Too enthusiastic, people might start wondering if you're too familiar with the beyond. It was a tightrope of belief, fashion, and performative awe. No one wanted to be the bore who didn't see the ghost in the punch bowl. So yes, the food might have been suspicious, the etiquette exhausting, and the corsets soul-crushing. But it was the after-dinner entertainment that truly blurred the line between a social call and an exorcism. One minute you're passing the mints, the next you're locked in spiritual combat with a ghost named Edward, who's offended you, folded your napkin wrong. Next time someone invites you to a Victorian-style dinner party, just remember, it's not over after the meal. You still have to face your destiny, your hostess's clairvoyant aunt, and possibly the undead, all while trying to digest a meat-flavoured jelly dome. Congratulations, you made it through the evening. You dressed yourself in 17 pounds of formal wear, survived the cutlery gauntlet, politely clapped for a violinist possessed by the spirit of melodrama, and ate something that may or may not have once been a fish encased in jello. The guests have left, the candles are guttering, and your host is somewhere off sobbing into a doily. But for you, dear guest, the night is far from over, because now begins the digestive aftermath. otherwise known as what fresh hell is this? You see, Victorian dinner parties didn't end when the last course was served. Oh no, that would have been merciful. Instead, they left you with something far more enduring, a night of intestinal regret, existential horror, and a possible brush with Victorian emergency medicine, which is to say, laudanum and luck. Let's start with the digestion. Your stomach, currently holding 14 courses of dubious meats, pickled root vegetables, arsenic-glazed pudding, and a final dose of brandy that could strip wallpaper, is rebelling. You feel it in waves. There's a low gurgling that sounds like it's whispering your name. You try to lie down, but, yes. You remember corsets. Your ribs are on lockdown. Your abdomen has the flexibility of a cast iron pipe. The only thing looser than your spine is your grip on reality. Now, the thing about Victorian digestion is that it was unreliable at best. This was an era where medical understanding was somewhere between "have you tried leeches" and "let's bleed them." That usually helps. Rich foods and lead-laced wine were considered fine dining. Fruits and fresh vegetables, suspicious, possibly too healthy. And food hygiene was, at best, theoretical. You, therefore, have a few options for how your body might retaliate. Option 1. Late-night vomiting, performed delicately into a decorative basin while your maid pats your back and pretends not to judge. Option 2. Sudden, unstoppable flatulence, which is both embarrassing and dangerous in tightly laced formal wear. Option 3. Intestinal stalemate, wherein your stomach simply refuses to do anything for 3 days, and you slowly begin to suspect the calf's brain mousse was your undoing. But wait. Help is at hand. Enter the Victorian medicine cabinet, which is about as reassuring as a bucket of snakes. There, nestled between the smelling salts and the blistering agents, you'll find your salvation: a tincture of opium, chloroform, peppermint oil, and blind faith, marketed under names like soothing syrup, patent digestive drops, or just Dr. Crumbleton's joyful elixir. These tonics promised relief, and delivered it, in the sense that you no longer cared if you lived or died. Feeling woozy? That's the opium. Feeling better? Also the opium. Can't remember your own name? Yep. Still the opium. And then there's the hangover, courtesy of that delightful claret which may or may not have been fortified with lead. Yes, you're dehydrated, dizzy, and trying to recall if it was the second or fifth glass that tasted faintly of turpentine. Either way, the next morning, you're regretting everything, especially complimenting Lord Farnsworth's chin mole. It was not a monocle. Speaking of regrets, let's not forget the social fallout, because unlike indigestion, which might pass with time and enough opiate syrup, saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, that could haunt you for seasons. Perhaps you laughed too loudly at the bishop's joke, or worse, didn't laugh at all. Maybe you used the wrong fork during the salad course, and Lady Witherington made a note of it in her velvet gossip ledger. You won't know until you're not invited to the spring cotillion, and if you really overstepped, like reaching for the bread with your left hand or God forbid leaving a pea uneaten, you might wake up to find your name has been ever so slightly snubbed from every invite list in town. Social death by asparagus. Even if you navigated the social minefield perfectly, there's still the matter of emotional damage. Victorian dinner parties were stressful. You spent 6 hours pretending to enjoy jellied tongue, deciphering cryptic conversation cues, and suppressing every natural instinct your body had. It's no wonder that some guests cried in the carriage on the way home, or sat up all night staring into the gaslight, trying to remember if blancmange was supposed to taste like glue and regret. And for the host, the aftermath was just beginning. Servants would be up until dawn scraping pigeon residue off porcelain, gathering wilted centerpiece hydrangeas, which, as we've established, may or may not have been trying to kill everyone, and restocking the medicine shelf with whatever tincture helped last time. Lady Havisham hallucinated her late husband during dessert. In the end, a Victorian dinner party was a high-stakes gamble in food, fashion, and fragile social equilibrium. The real test wasn't surviving the evening itself. It was surviving everything after: the stomach cramps, the whispered gossip, the moment you realized that Queen of Puddings wasn't a title, just something you now deeply regret eating. So yes, you made it out alive. But as you sit there, laced up, queasy, and staring into the abyss of your own choices, you begin to wonder, was it worth it? And then you get another invitation. God help you, you say yes. Congratulations. You've officially run out of money, options, and social standing. The only thing you've got left is a cough, a frown, and a heavy dose of 19th century shame. That's right. You've been accepted into the most soul-evaporating institution Victorian Britain had to offer, the workhouse. Let's set the scene. The year is 1834. Queen Victoria hasn't even hit the throne yet, but the government is already hard at work figuring out how to save money by making poor people suffer efficiently. Enter the Poor Law Amendment Act, which basically said, hey, instead of giving out aid like it's candy, let's make poverty so unbearable that people will avoid it like the plague, or at least until the plague shows up again. The solution? A network of state-run institutions called workhouses, where the destitute would be clothed, fed, and housed in exchange for having every last molecule of their dignity extracted and replaced with industrial-strength despair. You see, the idea wasn't to help people back on their feet. Oh no, that would be charity. And we can't have that. The idea was deterrence. A workhouse was less social safety net and more poverty purgatory. The state didn't want you to be comfortable. It wanted you to be grateful you weren't dead and terrified of ever ending up there again. Who got lucky enough to end up here? Pretty much anyone who was poor, sick, or unlucky enough to be born in the wrong decade. Widows? Check. Orphans? You bet. The elderly? Get in line. People with disabilities? Right this way. Entire families who got evicted because father broke his leg falling off a scaffold and can't work anymore. That'll be one workhouse application, please. And let's not forget the unemployed, whose biggest crime was having the nerve to not be hired during an economic downturn. In modern terms, being jobless got you a stern lecture. In Victorian terms, it got you locked up in a state-run building that makes a prison look cozy. Now on paper, a workhouse sounds mildly tolerable. Food? Shelter? Employment? Wow. Sounds kind of like a really bad Airbnb with chores. But in reality, stepping into a workhouse was like stepping into a Dickens novel, but without any of the whimsy. Just the cold, the hunger, and the 6 a.m. wake-up calls. The very act of entering a workhouse was an act of desperation. Society saw you not as someone who fell on hard times, but as someone who probably deserved it. Poverty was a moral failing, and the workhouse was the scarlet letter. You weren't helped. You were contained. People would delay going into the workhouse as long as humanly possible. They would sell their furniture, pawn their clothes, beg, starve, anything to avoid those iron gates. Because once you went in, you didn't just lose your home, you lost your identity. And let's talk about that stigma for a moment. Being a pauper was Victorian England's equivalent of walking around with a blinking neon sign that said, I'm a failure, and also probably lazy. Never mind that the economy was rigged, wages were laughable, and social mobility was a polite myth. If you ended up in the workhouse, it was clearly your fault for not bootstrapping your way into the upper class by sheer force of will and top hats. So what was life like inside? That's for later chapters. Spoiler, it's bleak. But for now, just imagine trading in your home for a cell, your freedom for a set of rules written by a moralizing bureaucrat, and your warm memories for institutional porridge. Families were separated, hope was crushed, and every aspect of your daily existence was designed to remind you, this is what happens when you ask for help. If you were lucky, you might one day be able to leave, scarred but free. If not, well, at least you'd be buried in the workhouse cemetery. That's a real thing. They even had mass graves, because nothing says we value human life like tossing bodies into a pit and calling it a day. In the end, the workhouse was the Victorian solution to poverty. Make it so degrading that people would do anything to avoid it. Starve quietly, freeze slowly, fade into obscurity, just don't become a burden. You've hit rock bottom, but Victorian England kindly provided a shovel so you can keep digging. You've made it past the gates. That's not the end of your misery, it's the opening act. Think of the admissions process, like a very bleak hotel check-in. If the hotel were run by people who hated you, and the only amenities included humiliation, lice shampoo, and mandatory family separation, welcome to step 1. Strip. No, not metaphorically. You're literally told to take off all your clothes. The workhouse doesn't want your fleas, your germs, or your sense of personal identity. You're no longer John Smith the carpenter, or Mary Hughes the widow. You're just pauper. #472, and you're shedding your old life like a snake sheds skin. except the snake probably had more privacy. Your belongings, if you had any, are confiscated and catalogued, that threadbare scarf from your dead grandmother, into the box. Those boots that took you 3 winters to save up for, too nice for a pauper, confiscated. They might give you a receipt, which is adorable, considering they're pretty sure you'll never own property again. Next, the bath. And no, this isn't the relaxing candle-lit kind. This is the scrub your dignity off, with communal soap kind. You are herded into a room that smells like wet despair and carbolic acid, and hosed down like livestock. Victorian hygiene wasn't exactly cutting edge, but here it felt almost weaponized. The water is cold, the sponge is shared, and the scrubbing is done by someone who has either no training or way too much enthusiasm. Then comes the delousing. Welcome to the chemical warfare portion of the check-in. The solution burns, smells like boiled regret, and may or may not work. But that doesn't matter. The goal isn't to make you clean, it's to make you compliant. You are now sufficiently humiliated, dehumanized, and soaked. Congratulations. You've passed the first level of bureaucratic hazing. Now comes step 2, uniform distribution. You're given workhouse clothing, lovingly stitched from the itchiest fabric known to mankind. It's like wearing a potato sack that's angry at you. And just in case you thought color might brighten your mood, the fabric is dyed a lovely shade of institutional drab, somewhere between mud and unforgivable beige. Gone is your identity. Gone is your autonomy. And now, gone is your family. You came in as a unit. Maybe you had a spouse. Maybe you had 3 children and a grandmother in tow. Maybe you had a cat. Not for long. Pets weren't allowed unless they could knit socks. But from here on out, you're segregated. Men in one ward, women in another. Children divided by age and gender and placed into their own separate wings. Babies shuffled off to nurseries with all the warmth of a freezer aisle. There were no family rooms, no shared meals, no bedtime stories. If you were lucky, you might see your loved ones once a week during supervised visitation, with a staff member watching like you were going to pass notes or plot a jailbreak. Hugs were discouraged, hope even more so. This wasn't just inefficient, it was deliberate. Victorian reformers believed that poverty stemmed from moral failure, and families needed to be broken apart to cleanse them of bad habits like affection, companionship, or having a support system. That's right. Love was seen as a slippery slope to idleness. The psychological toll was crushing. Parents would hear their children crying down the hall and not be allowed to comfort them. Husbands and wives who had been married for decades might only be permitted to nod at each other from across a courtyard like sad, sooty pigeons. Some never reunited. Death, illness, or transfers could ensure that your last goodbye came without warning, while a stern official checked his clipboard and told you to move along. By the time you were finally assigned a bed, you were no longer a person so much as a number wearing burlap. Your name had been filed away. Your past was considered irrelevant. Your future? TBD? Assuming your rations didn't kill you first. And here's the kicker. This was all just the first day. The workhouse didn't waste time pretending to be a place of healing. It wanted you to know, from the moment you stepped inside, that you were no longer part of polite society. You had fallen, and the system, instead of helping you up, just made sure you landed hard. You came in with a spouse, 3 kids, and a cat. You'll leave with trauma and possibly ringworm. Victorian England was not known for its sense of comfort. This was, after all, the same era that thought corsets were a good idea and that children should wear sailor suits while sweeping chimneys. But even by those standards, the fashion inside a workhouse was something else entirely. A bleak blend of sackcloth chic and prison core aesthetic. Let's begin with the uniform. Yes, the workhouse had a uniform. You might be thinking, hey, uniforms promote equality, and you'd be right. Equality in despair. These garments were designed not for comfort, style, or even practicality, but for humiliation. Picture this. A stiff, shapeless outfit made of coarse wool that felt like it had been spun from the regrets of unhappy sheep. The color was somewhere between industrial sludge and depression grey, and it was deliberately ugly because heaven forbid you feel any shred of self-worth while receiving public assistance. The male version of the uniform was typically a short, scratchy coat with matching trousers that could have doubled as sandpaper. Women got long dresses or gowns, equally rough and just as form-flattening, And there were no sizes, just too small to breathe or too big and trippable. The Workhouse didn't believe in tailoring. Dignity was not part of the package. To make sure you didn't get too attached to your own body, most uniforms were labelled or marked, sometimes with a pauper's badge. That's right, you wore your poverty like a name tag, in case anyone forgot that you were at the very bottom of society's social pyramid. If you somehow managed to leave the Workhouse for errands or jobs, people would see the badge and know instantly, ah yes, this person is broke, desperate, and very possibly lice-ridden. Some unions and districts used initials, P for pauper, W for workhouse ward, embroidered directly onto your clothes. Subtle? No. Shameful? Absolutely. Nothing like being publicly labelled in case your itchy beige nightmare didn't already scream, "My life's in shambles," and don't even think about accessorizing. No personal belongings were allowed. No rings, no scarves, no family lockets, certainly no shoes with character. Even your hair might be chopped off if considered unkempt or too fancy-looking for someone wallowing in institutionalized poverty. Why? Because personal items suggested individuality, and individuality was a luxury. If you brought in something sentimental, say, your mother's handkerchief or a locket containing a photo of happier times, rest assured it would be confiscated for safekeeping, which is Victorian for we're never giving that back. The idea was to turn every man, woman and child into a uniform unit of economic failure. A line of matching ghosts shuffling down the corridor in identical misery capes. No colour, no patterns, no variety, just one unbroken wave of bland beige suffering. Fashion Week. It was not. And don't get too comfortable. You didn't get to keep your uniform either. It stayed in the workhouse and was shared between inmates. Yes, shared. Like that one college hoodie your roommate kept borrowing. Except now it's a mass of wool soaked in sweat, tears, and probably porridge. Laundering? Technically? Yes. Realistically? Occasionally. You'd be lucky if your clothes didn't smell like last week's misery parade. Many inmates wore the same uniform for days or weeks at a time, and if you got a tear, you either fixed it with borrowed thread or accepted that your thigh was now on partial display during chapel. Shoes, too, were handed out in limited supply, and often ill-fitting. If you wore a size 7, you got a size 10. If you were a size 10, congrats. Your new shoes are made of wishful thinking and cardboard. Blisters were not a possibility, they were a guarantee. Some wards even required wooden clogs. Less footwear, more medieval punishment. They made you sound like a depressed horse, echoing through stone corridors, and caused enough foot pain to make you nostalgic for bare gravel. But why go through all this trouble to make people look and feel so dehumanized? Because this was the point. The uniforms weren't just clothes. They were a visual declaration of your status, a constant itchy reminder that you had failed to thrive in Victorian society. And now you were here, rebranded as state-owned, shame-wearing, charity-dependent cargo. And if you tried to forget that for one moment, the mirror, or that very judgmental old matron, would remind you. So yes, workhouse fashion came with a message, and that message was loud, clear, and made of terrible fabric. You are not meant to feel human in here. You are meant to feel manageable. Victorian fashion tip. If it scratches, smells, and makes you look like a sad potato sack, you're dressed just right. Welcome to the workhouse dining experience, where culinary is a generous term and crime is disturbingly accurate. If you've ever looked at a bowl of porridge and thought, this could use less taste, fewer nutrients, and more existential despair, then congratulations, your taste buds are perfectly primed for Victorian workhouse cuisine. Let's set the scene. You've been up since dawn, possibly scrubbing floor tiles with a toothbrush or breaking stones in the yard. You've earned yourself a hearty breakfast. Just kidding. You've earned gruel, that infamous, sludgy, oatmeal adjacent liquid that looked like it was made by someone who heard about flavour once but didn't care for it. What is gruel, exactly? Think of it as porridge's disappointing cousin who lives in a rain barrel, usually made from oats, barley or some other grain, watered down to within an inch of its nutritional life. It was boiled until it reached the consistency of regret. If it could hold its shape, it was too good for you. Grill was meant to be thin, grey, and soul-crushing. It was the culinary equivalent of being told you don't deserve joy, because that's really the heart of the workhouse meal philosophy. No pleasure, no satisfaction, just barely enough to not technically starve. You wouldn't die, but you wouldn't thrive. You'd persist, like mold on a cold windowsill. A typical day's menu might look like this. Breakfast, gruel, lunch, bread and broth. The broth was hot water with the memory of a vegetable waved over it. Dinner, gruel again, or more bread, depending on the day, and your crimes. Yes, crimes. Because even food could be used as punishment. If you talked back to the master, shirked your labor, or committed the gravest of all sins, looking mildly happy, you might be put on a punishment diet. What's a punishment diet, you ask? More gruel, but somehow worse. Imagine gruel, but thinner, colder, served with the loving scowl of a matron who hasn't smiled since the Crimean War. No salt, no sugar, and certainly no second helpings. It was like being waterboarded with porridge. Now, to be fair, in the most warped sense of the word, the diets were supposed to meet basic caloric needs. The Poor Law Commissioners published guidelines to ensure inmates received the minimal nutrition required to survive and work. But those guidelines were often ignored or interpreted in the most miserly way possible. Bread was stale, tea was so weak it could pass for slightly warm disappointment, and anything even remotely appetizing was usually reserved for the staff. There were rare meat days, but these were more symbolic than satisfying. A sliver of boiled meat, grey as the wallpaper, would be plopped onto your plate like an afterthought. No seasoning, of course. That might inspire hope. Speaking of bread, let's talk about the Victorian obsession with it. Bread was everywhere in the workhouse. Cheap, filling, and almost aggressively bland. Sometimes dry, sometimes slightly mouldy. Always served with the air of "what more do you want from us?" It was usually accompanied by the ever-mysterious dripping, animal fat scraped from the bottom of the cooking pot and smeared on like sadness jelly. Tea was technically offered, but don't get excited. It was often just hot water with a trace of leaf, brewed so weakly that calling it tea was like calling a mosquito a small dragon. Milk? Sugar? Not unless you bribed the cook with your last remaining tooth. And don't expect utensils that make sense. You might get a dented tin spoon. Knives and forks were considered too dangerous for paupers, because apparently someone once tried to shiv a fellow inmate over an extra crust of bread. Now, let's say you're ill. You might assume that being sick earns you some comforting broth or a boiled potato. No. You're likely to be served invalid gruel. That's gruel with even fewer calories, because nothing aids recovery like mild starvation. Children weren't spared either. The little ones got the same food as the adults, just in smaller portions, because Victorian logic dictated that tiny humans should suffer proportionally. And don't expect anyone to explain where your food came from. Was the milk watered down? Was the bread baked last week? Don't ask questions unless you want your tea switched out with gruel evening edition. But here's the kicker. The food wasn't supposed to be good. In fact, it was deliberately made joyless. The whole point of workhouse meals was to ensure that nobody looked forward to them. Authorities feared that if the food was too palatable, the destitute might start thinking of the workhouse as a decent option. Heaven forbid someone in extreme poverty get comfortable while avoiding death. So next time you stare into your fridge at 2 a.m. and complain there's nothing to eat, spare a thought for the souls who stared into a bowl of beige mush and saw their hopes floating in it. The good news, it's food. The bad news, you'll wish it wasn't. In most parts of the world today, childhood means snacks, school, and maybe too much screen time. In the Victorian workhouse, however, childhood meant employment, reluctant, relentless, and ruinous. Because nothing says, we value the next generation, quite like giving a 5-year-old a job that would make a grown man cry. Let's start with the basics. Childhood was not sacred in Victorian England. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything, including the way society viewed children. Instead of being pint-sized humans who needed care and play, they were now considered conveniently small, underpaid labourers. And if you were a child unlucky enough to be poor, orphaned, or born during a particularly uncharitable winter, straight to the workhouse you went. There was no wait until you're older. Talk here. Inmates as young as 5 were expected to contribute. By 7 or 8, they were full-time workers. In fact, if you could walk and vaguely follow instructions, congratulations, you were considered work-ready. Victorian society looked at children and saw not dreams or futures, but cheap labour in a tiny breakable body. And the jobs? Oh, they were something special. Here's a rundown of classic Victorian child torture disguised as work 1. Picking oakum, aka rope disassembly for tiny fingers. This was the gold standard of mind-numbing labor. Children were handed thick, tar-coated ropes, usually old ship ropes, and told to separate them into individual fibers, by hand, for hours. Imagine pulling apart greasy dreadlocks with a broken comb. Now do it for 12 hours straight, in silence, with bleeding fingers. Oakum was used to seal the gaps between ship planks or in prison construction, so in a cosmic twist, children were dismantling the ropes that would one day wall them in. If irony had a face, it would be a tar-smudged Victorian child trying not to cry into their rope pile. Example entry on their imaginary resume. First job, tiny rope prison. Achievements, 47 splinters and permanent thumb sadness. 2. Textile factories. Where your future unravels, older children, especially girls, were sent to work in textile mills. The machines were loud, fast, and deadly. If your hair, sleeve, or fingers got too close, you might lose a part of yourself. Literally, it was basically a deadly game of operation, except instead of buzzing, the machine just screamed, and so did you. Children were prized in these roles because they were small enough to crawl under moving machinery and fix jams. Think about that, kids. Under moving parts without turning the machine off. One false move, and it was goodbye fingers. Hello, lifelong trauma. 3. Chimney sweeping. Because children fit where adults can't. Tiny boys, some as young as 4, were sent up narrow chimneys with brushes, scraping soot and ash as they climbed. This was so common and so lethal that it became a dark national joke. Soot, inhalation, falls and burns were frequent. Some children got stuck and suffocated to death. Others developed soot wart, a type of skin cancer from all the grime exposure. But hey, at least it built character. And tumors. Parents today worry about their kid getting sick from licking a shopping cart. Victorian parents, they were just hoping little Timmy didn't get wedged between 3rd and 4th floor flues like a miserable meat cork. 4. Agriculture and brickyards. Miniature field hands. Not all child labor was industrial. Some kids were sent to farms to pick stones, scare birds, or weed fields from sunrise to sunset. Others worked in brickyards, carrying heavy loads or turning clay. It was like CrossFit for kids, except with more blisters and fewer Instagram posts. Children working outside faced their own special blend of danger, exposure to the elements, chronic fatigue, and the constant risk of being crushed by livestock, carts, or bricks. That's right, even the bricks were against them. And if you think the Victorian authorities might have taken a long, compassionate look at all this and said, wait, are we the baddies? Nope. The prevailing logic was that work built moral character, and idleness bred criminality. So clearly, the best way to keep kids out of trouble was to exhaust them into oblivion. As for schooling, theoretically, yes, some education was required. A few hours of lessons might be squeezed in between labor shifts, but by then, most children were too tired to learn anything besides how to fall asleep sitting up. Reading and writing took a backseat to how to not lose your hand in the loom. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Being separated from siblings and parents, subjected to adult-level responsibility, and punished for mistakes made in exhaustion, created a generation of children who were physically alive, but spiritually flattened. They weren't growing up. They were breaking down. If a child disobeyed, the punishments were just as bleak. Solitary confinement, reduced rations. Yes, even worse, gruel or public shaming. Because if there's anything more demoralizing than child labor, it's humiliated child labor. So next time someone complains about kids these days being too soft, kindly remind them that we no longer send 8-year-olds up chimneys to die of soot poisoning. Progress. Welcome to the adult section of the Workhouse, where the motto might as well have been "You're not lazy if your spine snaps under the effort." Because here, the goal wasn't just labor, it was demoralization with a side of tendon damage. Let's get one thing straight. You weren't in a workhouse to thrive, you were there to survive, barely. And the powers that be were very keen on making sure no one got too comfortable doing it. In fact, the entire system was designed to make poverty as painful and humiliating as possible. So you'd never even think of returning. Spoiler alert, people returned, because dying in the gutter was somehow worse. Now for adults, labor didn't mean a job with benefits, advancement, or even a paycheck. No, It meant unpaid, physically exhausting punishment, masquerading as productivity. Think of it like going to the gym, except the gym is a gravel pit, and instead of muscle tone, you leave with calluses, emotional trauma, and permanent resentment toward granite. Stone breaking, the Victorian version of a trust fall, but it's a sledgehammer. One of the most dreaded assignments was stone breaking. Armed with a mallet, you'd be placed in front of a pile of rocks and told to make them smaller. That's it. Break rocks into gravel, then do it again and again, until your hands blistered and your joints begged for mercy. There was no construction project waiting for the gravel, no purpose to the pile other than to keep you busy and remind you of your societal failure. The rocks weren't the only things breaking. Spoiler, so was your spirit. They even measured how much gravel you produced to ensure you weren't slacking. Didn't meet quota. Too bad. Less food, more punishment, or maybe just a friendly motivational scream from the overseer. Laundry. Now with extra boiling water and zero thanks. Let's say you got a lighter assignment. Laundry. Lucky you, right? Not so fast. This wasn't popping a load in the washer and browsing TikTok for 20 minutes. This was industrial-scale Victorian laundry for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of inmates. You'd be up to your elbows in boiling water, lye soap, and someone else's questionable undergarments. Scrub, wring, carry, hang, repeat. And again, don't forget, no gloves, no machines, no lunch breaks, just the gentle burn of chemical soap and existential dread. Laundry was especially brutal for women. Wet clothes weighed a ton, and wringing them out was a full-body workout you didn't sign up for. Add to that the heat, the smell, and the knowledge that you were washing the same uniforms that made everyone look like lost potatoes. And yeah, the glamour fades fast. Grinding corn. If you like endless circles and sore shoulders. Another popular adult job was grinding corn using massive hand-cranked mills. You turned the wheel, fed in corn, and hoped your arms didn't fall off before dinner. If stone breaking was brutal, corn grinding was tedious. A long, slow death by monotony. The same circle, the same sound, over and over, like a cursed merry-go-round that smelled like grain and failure. Occasionally, your reward for good grinding was more grinding. Because joy is for people with disposable income. Miscellaneous tasks. Everything hurts and you're still poor adults were also put to work on whatever was needed. Mending sacks, cleaning latrines, hauling coal, whitewashing walls, scrubbing floors. Basically, if it was heavy, gross, or soul-sapping, you were doing it. And guess what? Still no pay. Why? Because the whole system was based on the idea that you were working off your room and board. So while you're lugging firewood with a slipped disc, remember, your reward is not dying today. You don't earn money. You earn another night on the lice-stained cot, and a second helping of emotional numbness. A schedule designed by sadists. The workday typically lasted 10-12 hours. In summer, that could stretch even longer. Breaks were minimal. Supervision was constant. Slack off, and you'd be punished. Extra work, reduced food, or solitary confinement. The goal wasn't productivity, it was punishment. To grind the laziness out of you. The assumption was that if you were poor, it must be your fault. And if you just worked hard enough, you'd climb out of poverty, despite being trapped in a system that paid you with continued existence and arthritis. And how did the overseers motivate you? Simple, shame, yelling, and rigid discipline. Overseers weren't exactly trained HR professionals. Their main tools were surveillance and spite. Any slacking, talking, or perceived attitude, you got shouted at, or worse, written up, which usually meant punishment duty, or less food, and forget camaraderie. Talking during labor was discouraged or outright forbidden, because nothing builds morale like silently hauling bricks while questioning every life choice that led you here. In short, adult labor in the workhouse wasn't about fixing society or helping people recover. It was a grueling, joyless hamster wheel of humiliation designed to wring every ounce of effort out of you under the guise of moral improvement. And the worst part, this was considered mercy. This was the help. You weren't in prison, after all. You had it better. You were safe. Safe to die slowly with purpose. One bucket of laundry at a time. Let's talk cleanliness, or rather the complete absence of it. If you thought the Victorian workhouse was bad when it came to food, clothes, or labor, congratulations. Your immune system is about to enter its personal apocalypse. Welcome to the hygiene chapter. a thrilling journey through filth, contagion, and bodily despair, where the best-case scenario is only mildly infected. Because here's the honest truth, the workhouse was less clean and orderly institutions, and more petri dish with a bad attitude, bathing routines. A once-in-a-fortnight event. Maybe personal hygiene was not high on the workhouse priority list. Why? Because water cost money, soap cost money, time cost money, and you, poor soul, were cost reduction personified. No thing, if it happened at all, was infrequent, cold, and traumatizing. You'd be herded into a communal washing area, no privacy, no hot water, no respect for human dignity, and handed a bar of soap that had clearly already lost several fights. The bath water was reused, as in, you were marinating in everyone else's week-old regrets and skin flakes. If you bathed after the first few people, you weren't bathing so much as participating in a slow-cooked broth of sadness. Add in the occasional rat for seasoning, and voila, Victorian spa day. And ladies, don't think you got special treatment. Bathing routines for women were equally miserable, with the added joy of constant surveillance to make sure no one tried to smuggle in contraband like a comb. Toilets. The stuff of horror novels. Let's move on to the toilets, or as they should more accurately be called, open-air trauma centers. These were communal, poorly ventilated, and rarely cleaned. Sanitation consisted of hoping gravity and shame would take care of things. Imagine rows of wooden holes cut into benches over open cesspits. Privacy? Nope. Smell? Oh yes. You didn't sit on these benches so much as hover in terror, and hope your internal organs didn't give out. Flushing toilets weren't standard. Instead, chamber pots were emptied manually, by other poor souls sentenced to latrine duty. If you were lucky, you weren't downwind. If you were unlucky, congratulations, you've got cholera. Inmates were often tasked with cleaning the toilets themselves, a punishment that involved more mops than gloves and more shame than cleaning. Overcrowding, the breeding ground for disease. You didn't have your own room in the workhouse, you had a cot, and if you were extra fortunate, that cot came without bedbugs, but most often, it came with 36 wheezing strangers who'd all lost the will to live. Overcrowding was a constant issue. Dormitories were packed, shoulder to shoulder, with poor ventilation, zero airflow, and a musk that could legally be considered a biohazard. If someone got sick, and someone always got sick, you could bet it would spread faster than a Victorian moral panic. Social distancing wasn't a concept. Personal space, laughable. You shared bedding, air, and occasionally a lingering cough with your fellow inmates. Tuberculosis made itself very comfortable. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery, the unholy trinity. Welcome to your new roommates. Typhus, tuberculosis, and dysentery, or as the workhouse nurses like to call them, Tuesday. Typhus came from lice, which came from unwashed clothes, and bedding, which came from a budget that couldn't stretch to boiling water. Symptoms included fever, rash, and a sudden desire to write your will. Tuberculosis, that was the slow burn. The coughing up blood, wasting away in your shared cot, and being told to walk it off because you're not dead yet. And dysentery, well, if you love explosive diarrhea in a shared latrine with no toilet paper, you're in for a treat. People died regularly, and when they did, it wasn't uncommon for them to lie there until morning, because who had the energy to deal with that after 12 hours of stone breaking? The workhouse doctor, more guesswork than medicine. There was a doctor. Good news, right? Not really. Medical care in the workhouse was more about containment than cure. The goal wasn't to make you better. It was to keep you alive long enough to justify the cost of feeding you. If your leg wasn't falling off, you were probably fine. Doctors were overworked, underpaid, and armed with the medical expertise of a well-read blacksmith. Their toolkit included Leech's mercury opium, a wildly optimistic sense of how much bleeding a person could survive, anesthesia, rare, antiseptic. Please. This was the DIY dentistry era. If your tooth hurt, the solution was usually to rip it out with pliers and call it a day. For broken bones, a splint and a prayer. For fevers, you got moved to the fever ward and surrounded by others who'd already given up. In many cases, people who entered the infirmary never came out, not because of their initial illness, but because they caught something worse inside. Self-treatment, hope, hearsay, and the healing power of desperation. Many inmates resorted to folk remedies, or whispered advice from fellow sufferers. Wrap your chest in onions, one might say. Drink vinegar. Rub tar on your chest. These weren't treatments so much as acts of desperation backed by superstition and a lack of better options. And then there were the people who just gave up on being treated entirely. They knew what the infirmary meant. Once you went in, you were either leaving in a box or not at all. So, if the poor food and back-breaking labor didn't get you, hygiene just might. The workhouse didn't just crush your hope, it fermented it in a warm bath of shared sweat and respiratory infections. So you've made it past the delousing, the gruel, and the tuberculosis ward. Congratulations, but don't get too comfortable. Now comes the part where your spirit is squashed flatter than the workhouse bread. The rules and discipline system. If you thought this place merely felt like a prison, wait until you meet its moral compass. A rigid, joy-obliterating code of conduct enforced with military precision and Victorian smugness. Welcome to the schedule that makes boot camp look like a holiday. The daily workhouse routine was crafted with monastic-level obsession to order, designed to ensure not a single second of your worthless pauper life was wasted on anything as frivolous as thought. The bell rang at 5 or 6 a.m., depending on the season. Not the gentle chime of a modern alarm clock. This was more of a clang of doom that shakes your soul kind of bell. You got up, regardless of whether you'd slept, or merely laid in bed coughing next to 3 wheezing strangers all night. You had 10 minutes to dress, 5 minutes to line up, and 0 minutes to complain. Breakfast followed gruel, if you're lucky. But here's the twist. You had to eat in silence. Not please keep your voices down silence. No, this was monastery-grade, crypt-level silence, broken only by the scraping of spoons and the occasional suppressed sob. Meals weren't social time. They were punishment disguised as nourishment. Any whispering, laughing, or daring to hum a tune could result in disciplinary action. 1 minute, you're asking for more tea. The next, you're assigned latrine scrubbing duty with a toothbrush. The workhouse demanded total submission, not just in action, but in thought, posture, and facial expression. Looking too relaxed? Suspicious? Slouching? Probably lazy? Smiling? What do you have to be happy about? Everyone was expected to march, sit, eat, and work in the exact same way, every day. Individuality wasn't just discouraged, it was actively punished. You weren't a person. You were a moving part in the machine of moral reform, and no one was exempt. Children, elderly, even the disabled, everyone was expected to follow the same rules, no exceptions, no slack. If you could breathe, you could obey. So what got you in trouble in the workhouse? Talking at the wrong time, looking someone in the eye, taking too long to eat, trying to sneak out a crust of bread, being sick too often, not looking miserable enough. That's right. Being visibly alive was practically a violation. The moral philosophy was simple. Suffering built character, and if you weren't suffering, you must be up to something. The list of potential offences was endless. Even things that weren't technically against the rules could be punished if a staff member felt you were showing signs of idleness or disrespect. It was Victorian justice meets psychic policing. Now, let's say you did something truly heinous, like blinked twice during grace, or had the audacity to sit down when no one else was sitting. What happens then? Reduced rations, because clearly, what your body needed after 10 hours of work and 600 calories was even less food. Solitary confinement. Just you, 4 stone walls, and the echo of your dignity being stripped away. Extra labor. Sometimes your bonus job was something poetic like hauling buckets of rocks from one side of the yard to the other. Pointless, painful, and designed to remind you that joy is for the rich. Public shaming. Offenders could be forced to wear signs, sit apart from others, or be made examples of during meal times, because nothing builds morale like watching your fellow inmate weep into their gruel. In some cases, persistent misbehavior resulted in expulsion from the workhouse. You might think that was a blessing, until you realized the only thing worse than being in the workhouse was being outside of it, with nothing but a lice problem and no shoes. The true enforcers of discipline were not just the wardens or overseers. The worst of them were the moral guardians, well-meaning busybodies, convinced they were saving your soul by making your life hell. They believed poverty was a moral failing, not a structural one. So in their eyes, every punishment wasn't cruelty, it was character building. You weren't being humiliated for stealing a potato. You were being reformed through potato deprivation therapy. These people enforced rules with the energy of someone trying to win. Most sanctimonious, at the annual Sadists Gala, they handed out punishments with holy zeal and would genuinely smile while writing you up for excessive sighing. Over time, the structure didn't just manage your body, it crushed your mind. The routine was relentless. Wake, eat, work, sleep, repeat. No freedom, no spontaneity, no escape. Even Sundays, the supposed day of rest, were filled with mandatory church services, Bible readings, and lectures about how you probably deserved this, and heaven help you if you fell asleep during the sermon. That got you a full week of chamber pot duty. Eventually, the punishment wasn't just physical, it was existential. You didn't just fear the overseer, you feared the ticking clock of routine, the endless days of rules that never changed, and the terrifying realization that this might be your life until you died of natural causes, a Victorian euphemism for disease and despair. By this point in your workhouse journey, your body is broken, your stomach is haunted by gruel, and your sense of fashion has been murdered by itchy wool and institutional grey. But all of that is just the opening act. The real horror, the slow grinding erosion of you, takes place between your ears. Welcome to the mental toll of the workhouse, where depression is part of the decor, and your only escape is to forget who you were entirely. If you arrived at the gates of the workhouse as a person, you wouldn't stay that way for long. Welcome to institutionalization, population. One of the most devastating long-term effects of living in a Victorian workhouse wasn't just the physical labor or the hunger, it was the psychological transformation into someone who no longer remembered what freedom felt like. This is known as institutionalization, and it didn't take long to set in. Your every move was dictated: when to wake, where to sit, how to work, when to be silent, and how to be invisible. At first you may have resented the control, you may have longed to escape, but after enough time spent under the thumb of the schedule and the shame, something terrifying happened. You stopped dreaming, you stopped imagining a future, stopped believing you had any say in your own life. The outside world became a foggy, mythical place, and you became, quite literally, a cog in the system, worn, unremarkable, and replaceable. There's a special kind of pain in being reduced to a number, or worse, a cautionary tale. Workhouse inmates were no longer seen as individuals. You were no longer Mr. or Mrs. anything. You were that man from the laundry block, or the one with the cough, or Papa #12. No personal belongings, no voice, no privacy, and certainly no dignity. Many inmates came in with lives behind them. Jobs, relationships, maybe even a small business gone bust. But once inside, none of that mattered. You were now a walking embodiment of failure, and society was eager to keep you labeled that way. People didn't talk about those who had gone into the workhouse, unless it was with pity or judgment. If you were lucky, you were a sad footnote. If you were unlucky, your entire identity was rewritten as poor and unworthy. There's a term psychologists use called learned helplessness, the phenomenon where a person, after repeated failure or punishment, simply stops trying to escape or improve their situation, even when opportunities exist. Sound familiar? The workhouse was a masterclass in teaching this behavior. It punished initiative, crushed individuality, and made sure every attempt at hope or joy was met with either ridicule or punishment. Try to better your lot? You're accused of trying to cheat the system. Show ambition? Clearly, you're not grateful enough for the scraps you're given. Smile? Must be scheming. Eventually, people stopped trying at all, not because they didn't want to live better lives, but because the emotional toll of being constantly knocked back was too heavy to carry. If, by some miracle, you did manage to claw your way out of the workhouse, society didn't exactly throw a parade. No one handed you a certificate of resilience or a pat on the back. Instead, you were met with suspicion, stigma, and closed doors. You had been in the workhouse? Well then, you clearly couldn't be trusted. Employers were wary, landlords even more so. Your past followed you like a shadow, one made of failure, poverty and shame. In some towns, it was whispered about for years. Oh, you know him. He spent a season in the union. Don't let him near your silver. This created a cycle of hopelessness, where even those who left the system were pulled back in by the weight of public scorn, and the lack of opportunity. There were many who entered the workhouse in desperation, and simply never came out, not necessarily because they were forbidden to leave, but because they forgot how to. The idea of independence became terrifying. The thought of making choices was overwhelming. The world outside had changed, and so had they, into people who only understood confinement. Some inmates stayed for decades, some died within its walls, not as tragedies but as fixtures. Old Mr. So-and-so from the sewing ward, or that silent woman in the corner, who hasn't spoken since 1873. They weren't held by locks and chains, but by mental walls they could no longer climb. Their prison was now inside them. You might think you could at least process your grief, but even that was denied. Sadness was considered laziness. Crying was disruptive. Despair had no place in the rigid routine, unless you could manage to squeeze it into your 30-minute lunch break. Your biggest dream now is to have a quiet cry without getting yelled at for idleness. The real horror, becoming numb. Perhaps the most haunting truth about the workhouse wasn't the disease, the hunger, or the cold. It was the way it slowly erased your inner world. It turned human beings into ghosts alive. Yes, but with nothing left to feel, and no one who cared if they did. Because in the end, the greatest cruelty of the Victorian workhouse was not that it took your body, it took your hope and made you feel like you deserved it. So you've survived the lice, the gruel, the child labour, the rock breaking, and the moral lectures from people whose only job is to remind you how much of a disappointment you are. The question now is, how do you leave the workhouse? Well, there are a few options. Most are tragic. One is romantic barely, and all of them carry the same bittersweet reward. Freedom, sort of followed closely by lifelong judgment and invisible branding. Let's unpack your potential escape routes from this cheerful Victorian institution. Spoiler alert. Death remains the most efficient. Exit strategy #1. Death. The permanent checkout. Let's just be honest. This was the most common exit. A great many workhouse inmates never walked out the front gate. They were wheeled out the back in a box. The lucky ones got a pauper's funeral. The unlucky ones, well, there were reports of unclaimed bodies being used in medical schools for anatomy practice. Because nothing says, "Thank you for your service," like being posthumously disassembled by a shaky-handed student. No headstone, no family procession, just a burial trench, shared with several others. Maybe a wooden marker that says something vague, like male, 70s, indigent. You lived a life of obscurity and poverty, and death kindly made sure it stayed that way. But hey, at least the gruel stopped. Exit strategy #2. Employment. A job, not a life. Now let's say you survived. Your lungs didn't give out, your back didn't snap like an old fence post, and your will to live somehow resisted being entirely stomped out by itchy uniforms and social contempt. Congratulations. You might just qualify for a job. Workhouse officials love to place able-bodied inmates into employment. Not necessarily good employment. Think of it as Victorian temp work with no pay negotiating power. Domestic service, factory work, road construction. Anything that moved you from burden on the parish to someone else's problem. But don't celebrate too soon. These weren't career-launching opportunities. Employers knew you were a former workhouse inmate, and that label didn't wash off. You were viewed as suspicious, untrustworthy, and probably contagious with something metaphorically or literally unpleasant. Expect low wages, long hours, and a persistent sense that everyone's watching you for signs of relapse into poverty. So yes, you left the workhouse, but it never really left you. Exit strategy #3. Marriage. The Victorian lottery ticket now. Here's the rarest of all marriage as an escape plan. Occasionally, a young woman might find a husband willing to overlook her workhouse origins, or a man might charm his way out by attaching himself to someone with slightly more money and social standing. Love, in the workhouse, was both taboo and transactional. You weren't allowed to court inside. No canoodling in the laundry shed, but that didn't stop the occasional whispered romance or daring flirtation over shared gruel. Sometimes, outside visitors took pity, or had suspiciously specific help-wanted wife vibes. But let's not romanticize this too much. Marrying out of the workhouse was like winning the lottery. If the lottery came with the constant fear of being sent back, if the marriage fell apart, you had to prove your ability to support each other financially. If that failed, it was right back to the dormitory of despair. Even once you were free, Victorian society rarely let you forget where you'd been. The The workhouse was supposed to be a deterrent, and part of that deterrence was the permanent social scar it left behind. Former inmates were routinely discriminated against. Employers blacklisted them. Neighbors whispered. Potential suitors suddenly remembered urgent plans far away. And if you ever hit hard times again, guess where you'd end up? You became a living ghost, a walking reminder of failure in a society obsessed with status and self-sufficiency. And you were expected to feel grateful for it. You finally escaped the workhouse. Congrats. Now society just ignores you instead of locking you up. Despite their cruelty, workhouses didn't disappear overnight. They were slowly phased out during the early 20th century, especially as attitudes toward poverty shifted from moral failing to maybe people just need help. Some became hospitals, others became housing for the elderly. Many were bulldozed, but the blueprint remained. The bureaucratic suspicion, the belief that aid should be painful to discourage dependence. Even in modern welfare systems, you can still see echoes of the workhouse mentality, just with more paperwork and fewer lice. The poor law system that birthed the workhouse was finally repealed in 1948, when the National Assistance Act was introduced in Britain, promising real support without humiliation. It was a victory for dignity, decades late, but still something. So, what's the moral of the story? If you were poor in Victorian England, the workhouse wasn't a safety net. It was a net full of holes with iron bars and a lot of judgment. And if you got out, you carried the weight of that experience everywhere you went, stamped invisibly on your back. But the fact that people survived it, and some even fought to reform it, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The workhouse tried to break people, some bent, some shattered, but others walked out those doors, scarred but standing, and sometimes that's enough. Congratulations. You've joined a democratic floating dumpster fire armed with cannons, smells like mildew, sweat, and possibly a decomposing fish stuck in the rigging. The good news is, you're not in the Royal Navy. The bad news is, you might wish you were once you get a whiff of the hammocks. But hey, at least you're officially a pirate now. Though how you got here might have been less about swashbuckling dreams, and more about unfortunate life choices, questionable friends, and the inability to swim away fast enough. Let's be clear, most people didn't exactly apply to be pirates. There was no cheerful recruiter with a pamphlet saying, "Join the pirate life. See the world. Eat bugs. Maybe die screaming." Nope. The road to piracy usually began with desperation. Maybe you were an out-of-work sailor kicked off your last merchant ship for accidentally setting the galley on fire. Maybe you were a farmer who got tired of taxes, mud, and not owning any of your teeth. Or maybe you just really hated mornings and heard pirates didn't believe in waking up before noon unless a cannon was involved. Then there was the ever-charming method of recruitment known as press ganging. This delightful process involved being drunk in the wrong tavern at the wrong time. 1 minute, you're enjoying a mug of something pretending to be ale, and the next, you're waking up with a splitting headache, a mysterious bruise, and an ocean view. Congratulations, says the quartermaster. You've been hired, permanently. Some people signed on after being rescued, well, liberated, by pirates. Picture this. Your ship is boarded, your captain runs away screaming, and after a brief scuffle, the pirates offer you a choice. Option A, swim home. Good luck. Option B, join up, and maybe live long enough to get scurvy. You don't need to be a genius to know which way that usually went. They even had a word for this gentle form of persuasion, being voluntold. Mutiny was another job fair opportunity. If your ship was poorly led, your rations were terrible, and your captain thought flogging was a hobby, someone might suggest a little restructuring. Suddenly, there's a new captain, a slightly blood-stained crew vote, and a bold new business plan. Piracy, retirement savings, whatever you can carry in a sack. But no matter how you got here, nothing prepared you for that first moment on deck. The ship rolls beneath your feet like a drunk octopus. The rigging is a tangled web of ropes and curses. The crew yells in 17 different accents. You can't tell if that's a parrot or a demon, but it definitely just bit someone. Oh, and the smell. A unique bouquet of salt, fish guts, unwashed men, and something died weeks ago, and we're all pretending it didn't. Ode a Pirate, coming soon to no stores ever. There is no orientation session, no friendly welcome kit, no training videos with cartoon parrots explaining the rules. You just dive in, sometimes literally, If someone wants to haze the new guy, you learn fast, or you learn to swim, or you stop learning entirely and become shark food. The only HR department on board is the guy with the biggest knife and the least patience. Disputes are solved with shouting, drinking, or the occasional duel, and those are just the friendly ones. Still, for all its chaos, the pirate ship had a kind of bizarre charm. It wasn't the Navy. There were no snobby officers barking orders just because their dad owned half of Hampshire. No 12-hour shifts, scrubbing someone else's deck with a toothbrush. Here, if you pulled your weight, didn't steal anyone's rations, and avoided vomiting on the quartermaster's boots, you earned your place. Even better, you got a share of the loot, not a wage. A share, like a bizarre rum-soaked startup, where everyone's a co-founder and the product is not getting sunk. And unlike the stiff, class-ridden hierarchy of the Navy, here your past didn't matter much. Ex-slaves, ex-soldiers, and ex-everythings worked side by side. If you could handle a blade and keep your balance during a storm, you were in. If not, well, there was always the next mutiny. So yes, the pirate ship was a disaster with sails. It was loud, it was filthy, and it was about as organized as a drunken brawl in a broom closet. But it was also freedom. Twisted, rum-splashed, probably ends in cannon fire freedom. You answered to the sea, the wind, and a guy named Pegleg Barry, who once ate a man's sock on a dare. You were a pirate now. Time to learn the ropes, and hope they weren't the ones used for hangings. Democracy on a pirate ship. One man, one vote, unless he's unconscious, in which case the parrot votes for him. And let's be honest, the parrot usually has better judgment. You might assume that pirate ships were ruled by fear, violence, and the guy with the biggest sword yelling the loudest. And okay, some of that is true, but underneath all the shouting and accidental stabbings, pirate life was surprisingly democratic. That's right, these grog-soaked hooligans floating in splinters across the high seas had a more functional voting system than most 17th century governments. In fact, pirate ships were often miniature floating republics. No aristocratic nonsense here, no noble birth giving you automatic command. If you wanted to be captain, you had to earn it, preferably without stabbing too many competitors during the interview process. At the core of this salty democracy was the pirate code. Despite sounding like something invented by a theme park, the code was a real set of rules, often written down and agreed upon by every crew member before the ship even set sail. And no, you couldn't just skip it and click, accept terms and conditions. Everyone had to sign it. Literate pirates signed their names. The rest made a mark, and hoped no one noticed it was actually a doodle of a fish. This code governed everything. How loot was split, usually surprisingly fairly, what punishments applied for various crimes. Spoiler, they were not gentle, and how decisions were to be made, and those decisions, done by vote. Yup, it wasn't just captain says so. It was captain says so, unless the rest of us disagree, in which case we tie him up and pick someone else. Captains were elected by the crew, and could be de-elected just as quickly. If you were too cruel, too greedy, or just really bad at avoiding cannonballs, you might find yourself voted out and replaced by someone with slightly better odds of survival, or slightly better aim. And if you pushed your luck too far, you might not be voted off the ship. You might just be offed. Period. But the captain wasn't the only role voted on. The quartermaster was arguably even more powerful. Think of him as the ship's COO. He managed the day-to-day operations, resolved disputes, oversaw division of booty, no, the treasure kind, pervert, and made sure no one was hoarding the biscuits. In a crisis, the captain took charge. In the daily grind, it was the quartermaster, keeping the chaos marginally organized. There were other roles too, depending on the size of the ship and the creativity of the crew. The boatswain oversaw maintenance and sails. If you wanted to float and not die, you listened to him. The carpenter patched holes and replaced masts that had inconveniently exploded. And then there was the surgeon, who was usually just the guy who owned the least rusty saw and had steady enough hands to not amputate the wrong limb. His qualifications often included, didn't faint at the sight of blood, and only occasionally drinks on the job. Now, before you start imagining these guys holding orderly town hall meetings with minutes and agendas, let's temper expectations. Pirate democracy was often more liquid than logical, especially when rum was involved, which was often. Voting could be chaotic. Sometimes it was shouting, sometimes it was a show of hands, sometimes it was whoever throws a bigger knife into the deck wins, and sometimes decisions were made after a 4-hour drinking session, followed by 3 hours of fistfights and a nap. Still, the system worked, kind of. For a bunch of unwashed, heavily armed anarchists, pirates actually maintained a functioning structure where power was distributed, voices were heard, and the guy in charge didn't automatically get all the gold. Loot was split according to role and risk. Captains and quartermasters got larger shares, sure, but even the lowliest deckhand walked away with something, assuming he still had both legs, and didn't gamble it all on a crab race at the next port. But woe unto the pirate who broke the code, stealing from the crew. That could earn you marooning. A lonely exile on some godforsaken island with a bottle of water and a pistol with one shot. Start a fight below deck and set the ship on fire. That's a flogging, mate. Disobey a direct order during battle. Well, accidents happen at sea, like tripping overboard. With cannonballs tied to your ankles, pirates didn't just value their code, they enforced it with terrifying creativity. It was part survival mechanism, part honor system, part we don't want to kill each other until at least after the treasure is buried. It ensured that despite the absolute madness of life at sea, there were rules, brutal, chaotic rules, but rules nonetheless. So yes, pirate democracy was far from perfect. It was messy. It was occasionally explosive. It could end with someone being tied to the mast and pelted with spoiled fruit. But for many sailors, especially those fleeing tyranny, conscription or bad royal dental plans, it was a strange and welcome taste of freedom, a taste that, unlike the ship's biscuits, didn't come with weevils. If it crunches, and it isn't supposed to, it's probably extra protein. That's the pirate culinary motto. Welcome to the high seas buffet, where the menu is limited, the flavor is offensive, and the risk of intestinal distress is off the charts. Here you don't dine, you survive. And if you're still upright after dinner, congratulations, you've beaten the odds and the botulism. Let's start with the showstopper of every pirate meal, hardtack. This was not a food so much as a building material that accidentally got classified as edible, a sort of biscuit-brick hybrid. Hardtack was baked until it could outlive the sun. You didn't bite into it so much as file away at it with your remaining teeth. Break it over your knee, and you might break your knee instead. Pirates sometimes had to soak it in grog just to make it chewable, which meant it absorbed the flavor of alcohol and failure. And speaking of alcohol, enter grog, a charming concoction of watered-down rum, sometimes laced with lime juice, sometimes with sugar, and often with disappointment. While it began as a way to stretch the alcohol rations and reduce scurvy, it quickly became the lifeblood of every pirate crew. Not for hydration, mind you. Grog was less about quenching thirst and more about making you forget you were drinking out of a barrel previously used for salted fish. Now, if hardtack and grog don't whet your appetite, fear not. There's always salted meat, the catch-all term for animal matter so heavily preserved it, legally qualified as a fossil. This could be beef, pork, or something more mysterious depending on what they managed to acquire before setting sail. After weeks at sea, the meat turned a peculiar shade of despair and developed its own personality. The salt content was so high that it could preserve your soul. Pirates would sometimes find maggots nestled inside, and instead of tossing the meat, they just shrugged and called it extra chew. Then there were ship's biscuits, which were like hardtack's smaller, more weevil-infested cousin. Over time, these biscuits would develop a soft crunch, not from baking, but from the colonies of insects that had moved in. The general rule was, if it moved, cook it again. If it didn't move, it was probably dead, or nearly. Of course, pirates being pirates, they didn't rely solely on their dwindling rations. A fair amount of their diet came from stealing. Raided merchant ships and coastal towns often offered a brief, glorious moment of food variety. Spices, fresh produce, maybe a terrified chicken. But such feasts were rare and quickly devoured. After that, it was back to the barrel of despair. And what was in that barrel? Sometimes pirate stew, a term so vague it should come with a warning label. Pirate stew was the culinary equivalent of don't ask, don't smell, just eat. It might contain leftover meat, soggy biscuit crumbs, bits of dried pea, mouldy onion, and whatever had fallen on the floor and wasn't nailed down. If it had texture, it went in the pot. Some pirate stews achieved such chemical complexity that they began to ferment into a stew-wine hybrid. That didn't stop anyone from eating it. It only made the hallucinations more interesting. Storage was its own kind of nightmare. Food barrels were leaky, moldy, and prone to becoming ecosystems. Flour often turned into paste when the humidity got too high, making it perfect for glue but not pancakes. Cheese, when it existed, either exploded from gas buildup or became sentient and asked for voting rights. Eggs didn't last more than a few days, and fresh fruit, that was a myth. Pirates told children. Then there was the great liquid disaster, water. You'd think that being surrounded by an ocean would help, but salty seawater isn't exactly potable. Rainwater was collected when possible, but most stored water went bad fast, turning green, slimy, or frothy, with mysterious life forms. That's partly why grog became so popular. Rum didn't rot, even if your liver did. Despite the horror show that was their food supply, pirates managed to keep sailing, mostly through lowered standards and a firm belief that hunger tastes better than flavor. Meals were taken together, sometimes in grim silence, sometimes accompanied by off-key sea shanties and the occasional fistfight over a cleaner piece of mold. Interestingly, even though nutrition was an afterthought, some pirates fared better than naval sailors. Why? Because while navies had strict rules and endless bureaucracy, pirates were opportunists. If they landed somewhere with goats or coconuts, they took full advantage. If they spotted a ship loaded with fine wine and bread, they took that too, along with the ship. In pirate terms, meal planning meant spotting a fat merchant ship and sharpening your cutlass. In the end, the pirate diet wasn't about enjoyment, it was about endurance. Could you survive the next meal? Could your intestines forgive you? If yes, you were one step closer to living another day and possibly even finding that mythical island with actual fresh food. You don't stink. You've just been properly aged, like a barrel of salted pork. Welcome aboard the stench, where deodorant is a myth, showers are legends, and personal hygiene is more of a suggestion shouted over the retching of seasick crewmates. On a 17th century pirate ship, disease wasn't just lurking in the shadows, it was practically running the ship's social calendar. Let's talk bathing, or more specifically, the spectacular absence of it. Pirates bathed about as often as they paid taxes, which is to say, never. Water was a precious commodity, strictly reserved for drinking, and even then, grudgingly. Using it to wash yourself was considered a waste, or worse, an act of vanity. If a pirate did manage to scrub the filth off, he was probably about to die and wanted to be presentable for the afterlife. Otherwise, the only bath you got was an unplanned splash from a rogue wave or falling overboard, and even then, someone might shout waste of perfectly good filth, and yet somehow, bathing was the least of your concerns. You shared your life, your food, and unfortunately, your body with a thriving ecosystem of lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Pirates itched constantly, scratched violently, and accepted their new insect overlords as part of shipboard life. It wasn't just you who had lice. Everyone had lice. Grooming became a group effort, the way primates do it, minus the dignity. And if you wanted to know if someone was truly your friend, they were the ones who picked the bugs off your scalp without judgment. Let's not forget the rats, because they didn't forget you. Rats were permanent passengers. They gnawed through food stores, nibbled on your boots while you slept, and made nighttime bathroom trips into horror movie scenes. Occasionally, rats were hunted for sport, or out of hunger, depending on the condition of the ship's salted meat. But mostly, you just learned to live with the squeaks and the occasional furry blur scuttling across your hammock. Ah yes, hammocks. Pirates didn't have beds, they had canvas slings crammed side by side below deck in a space, so cramped you could high-five the guy snoring next to you without lifting your arm. Hammocks were rarely washed, and almost never dry. Sweat, seawater, spilled grog, and every known body odor soaked in like marinade. The resulting smell was what you'd get if a locker room in a slaughterhouse had a baby, and raised it on rotten fish. If the smell of the ship didn't get to you, your mouth would. Dental hygiene was non-existent. Pirates didn't brush, floss, or rinse. They just hoped their teeth stuck around longer than their enemies. But thanks to a little thing called scurvy, those hopes were dashed. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, didn't just make your gums bleed, it made them rot, swell, and turn black. Teeth fell out in clumps. Gums looked like overripe strawberries left in the sun. Breath? Imagine a compost bin filled with regret. And still, Pirates managed to flirt with tavern girls, the confidence, but perhaps the crowning jewel of pirate hygiene or lack thereof was the communal toilet. Enter the poop deck. No, it's not a child's joke. The term comes from the French la poupe, the stern, and it's where pirates often relieved themselves over the edge into the sea, while praying the ship didn't lurch. Timing was everything. A bad wave or poorly tied belt could mean a humiliating dip in shark-infested waters, pants around ankles, dignity gone with the tide. On rougher days when seas were stormy or privacy was impossible, pirates made use of the communal bucket. Yes, a literal bucket, in a shared space, on a moving ship. And no, it didn't get emptied often. This bucket, unofficially called the thunder jug or seat of doom, sat in a corner of the ship, like an unholy relic. Step too close in the dark, and you might tip it over. A man could survive gunfire, swordplay, and starvation, but no one could survive the emotional damage of being splashed by the bucket. You might wonder how anyone could function in this cloud of human decay. The answer: your nose gave up. After a few days, your senses numbed. The filth became your reality. In fact, pirates took a strange pride in their aroma. Cleanliness was for aristocrats and landlubbers. Out here, you were marinated in salt, sweat, and scorn. The smell didn't repel crewmates. It bonded them. If you all reeked equally, nobody noticed. Diseases spread fast. Typhus, dysentery, skin infections, and a host of unnameable conditions traveled faster than rumors. Boils, rashes, and festering wounds were part of your look. You weren't fully dressed until you had at least 3 mysterious growths. There was no shame, only scratching. Yet, despite this glorious tapestry of disease and decay, many pirates lived longer than their naval counterparts. Why? Because pirates, unlike navy men, weren't stuffed into ships with hundreds more crew. Pirate ships were smaller, more spacious, relatively speaking, and democratic. If a pirate stank, it was his right to do so freely and independently. Liberty, equality, and lice. The pirate code. So next time you complain about someone's gym bag smell, remember, at least your roommate isn't using a communal bucket, and your gums are probably still intact. He can't spell artery, but he sure can find one with a rusty knife. Welcome to the sick bay, also known as that corner of the ship that smells vaguely like rotting meat and defeat. In the glamorous world of 17th century piracy, healthcare wasn't just primitive, it was a cross between medieval guesswork and outright panic. There were no degrees, no medical boards, and no hand sanitizer. If someone on board called themselves a surgeon, that meant they once saw a real one from across a bar, maybe. Let's begin with the headliner of pirate plagues: scurvy, the citrus-deprived menace of the sea. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy was nature's way of reminding pirates that yes, vegetables matter. The disease started subtly: fatigue, joint pain, and irritability. You might chalk it up to a hangover, or the fact that you'd been sleeping in a mouldy hammock next to a guy named Rotten Phil. But soon, things escalated. Gums swelled like overcooked sausages, old wounds reopened, teeth fell out like coins from a broken purse, and bruises appeared, just from the act of existing. Imagine waking up and finding your mouth bleeding because you sneezed. That's scurvy. The cure: fresh fruit. The problem? You're on a boat in the middle of the ocean where the closest lemon is 2,000 miles away and probably costs more than your share of the loot. And scurvy was just the start. Pirate ships were floating petri dishes of typhus, dysentery, and whatever fungal nightmare lived in the ship's biscuits. Typhus was spread by lice, which every pirate had. So you basically had a built-in disease delivery system living in your hair. It brought on high fever, delirium, and eventually death, usually while someone was trying to hold you down so you didn't bite your own tongue off. Dysentery, the elegant name for explosive, often bloody diarrhea, was a crowd favorite. You'd get it from drinking contaminated water, which is a fancy way of saying any water available on the ship. The communal bucket. Yes, that bucket didn't help. Once you had it, you'd dehydrate faster than a biscuit in the sun. And since pirates weren't big on oral rehydration, the only treatment was hope. Or maybe grog, which made everything worse. Now let's talk surgery, because nothing screams pirate medicine like someone removing your leg while humming a sea shanty. Amputation was the go-to fix for just about any problem below the neck. Cut, saw, cauterize. 3 steps to survival, assuming you didn't bleed out or go into septic shock from the splinters still embedded in the wound. The tools? Oh, the tools. Bone saws, often rusty, hooks used for more than decoration, and knives that had previously been used to butter maggoty biscuits. If you were lucky, someone would pour rum on the wound, and maybe into your mouth. If not, you just bit down on leather and tried not to scream louder than the guy who went before you. Anesthesia? That's adorable. There was no such thing. Pirates were told to be brave while someone took off a limb with all the finesse of a drunken carpenter, hacking through furniture. The pain was indescribable. The trauma, lifelong. If you survived, congratulations. You now had a stump and a nickname like One Leg Pete. The ship's surgeon, such as he was, operated out of a space lit by flickering candles and pure optimism. He may have had a few actual tools, a handbook written in Latin that he couldn't read, and a bucket of leeches. Knowledge of the human body was largely experimental. What happens if we remove this? Was a genuine question. Anatomy lessons came from dead crewmates, hearsay, or crude diagrams drawn on rum-stained maps. Sterilization? Never heard of her. Instruments were reused without cleaning. Bandages were made from old rags or bits of clothing, sometimes literally the shirt off a dying man's back. Infection was not a possibility. It was a certainty. If your wound didn't go green and start smelling like old cheese, you were either magical or already dead. Because of all this, many pirates feared their surgeon more than cannonballs. A cannonball might kill you instantly. A surgeon might drag it out, soaring away with enthusiasm, but no clear plan. Pirates would often hide injuries just to avoid being helped. A gash to the leg, just a scratch. That festering sore, a love bite from the sea. Only when the limb started falling off did they admit something might be wrong. Despite the horrors, pirates actually valued their medical practitioners. Some surgeons were former naval doctors who'd gone rogue, or at least managed to not kill too many patients in a row. Those with experience, even bad experience, were better than none. A halfway competent surgeon could mean the difference between returning to port and being tossed overboard in a burial ceremony that mostly involved shrugging. And yet, with all these plagues and pains, pirates carried on. They joked through bloody surgeries, drank through chronic infections, and sang through fever dreams. Pain was part of the lifestyle, same as the danger and the bad food. You weren't just a pirate, you were a survivor. A very leaky, infected, and slightly gangrenous survivor. Bored. Just wait till Carl drunkenly challenges the mast to a duel again. So you've survived the maggot biscuits, the plague bucket, and that one time you sneezed so hard your tooth fell out. Now what? You're in the middle of the ocean. Your job involves occasional murder and treasure hunting, and the nearest tavern is 800 nautical miles away. Time to ask the big question. What did pirates do for fun? The answer? Just about anything short of boredom-induced mutiny, which, yes, also happened occasionally. Life on a 17th century pirate ship was long stretches of sheer tedium, punctuated by moments of absolute chaos. So when cannonballs weren't flying and limbs weren't being sawn off, pirates found creative ways to pass the time. Let's start with gambling. A pirate's favorite way to lose what little money they had before they could even spend it. Pirates bet on everything. Dice games, card games, cockroach races, who could spit the furthest into the wind, and even which unlucky crewmate would be the first to fall off the rigging while drunk. Wagers weren't always in coin. Often they'd gamble with rations, clothes, rum, or the promise not to throw someone overboard during the next squall. And when the dice were lost or eaten by rats, pirates turned to singing, and not just the romantic sea shanties you hear in movies. No, these songs were bawdy, aggressive, and about as subtle as a cannon to the face. You'd get ditties about ex-girlfriends with wooden legs, battles with sea monsters, red, large tuna, and verses that involved more bodily functions than musical notes. The lyrics changed with each rendition, usually depending on who was drunk, who was angry, and who was close enough to punch. Ah yes, the sea shanty. These weren't just for fun. They helped set rhythm for hauling ropes or rowing, but once the chores were done, the lyrics got spicy. Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum was the PG version. The real stuff would make a sailor blush, and probably include a verse about someone's suspicious rash and a goat named Beatrice. When they weren't singing or gambling, pirates indulged in knife-throwing contests, which were exactly as safe as they sound. The rules were loose. the targets vague, and the injuries frequent. Sometimes the mast was the target, sometimes a barrel, sometimes Carl, who really shouldn't have stood still that long. It was a mix of skill, ego, and light bloodshed, just enough excitement to keep things spicy without a full-blown mutiny. And then there was storytelling. After all, who doesn't love a terrifying tale while sitting on a damp wooden plank surrounded by darkness and the subtle creak of wood, suggesting the ship might, at any moment, collapse into the sea? Pirates told ghost stories, embellished tales of battles they definitely won single-handedly, and lies about the treasures they almost found. Every pirate had a story about a mermaid, a ghost ship, or a time they drank an entire keg of rum and survived a sword fight with nothing but a spoon. You also had your share of make-believe, especially after extended voyages when the rum rations got light and the cabin fever got heavy. Some pirates talked to the ship, others played with imaginary friends, and then there was Mermaid Lisa, a recurring character in many pirate hallucinations. Was she a siren? A hallucination brought on by salted pork and sunstroke? Who's to say? All we know is at least one pirate was regularly caught serenading a mop and calling it Lisa. Pets were also a thing. Parrots weren't just accessories. They were loud, judgmental, and very into swearing. Monkeys were chaos gremlins who could pick locks, steal food, and bite faces. And every once in a while a ship would have a cat, part pest control, part crewmate, and full-time supervisor of all things fishy. Having a pet on board provided a strange sense of comfort. It was someone to blame for farting below deck, or for stealing that one dry biscuit. When times got really dull, pirates got inventive. Wrestling matches on the main deck, improvised sports using coconuts, mast climbing competitions, which ended poorly. Every time. One memorable pastime involved putting a blindfolded pirate in a barrel and spinning him until he vomited, then declaring him Poseidon's pick. No one ever explained the rules, but it was great fun for everyone not in the barrel. All this mayhem served an actual purpose. These activities, ridiculous as they seem, kept morale from plummeting into the briny deep. A ship full of bored pirates was a ship one bad mood away from slicing each other open with cutlasses. Laughter, competition, and a healthy dose of absurdity were key to keeping the crew from turning full Lord of the Flies. Entertainment on a pirate ship was about making the unbearable bearable. It was about finding joy in the utterly disgusting, humor in the horrific, and distraction from the fact that death could come from anything. From disease, storm, enemy cannon, or just accidentally standing in front of Carl during one of his sword dance performances. So, next time you're bored and tempted to complain about Netflix buffering, remember, your ancestors were probably on a creaking ship, singing filthy songs with a parrot and dodging knives in the name of fun. Plan A, fire the cannon. Plan B, hit them with the cannon when it misfires. Congratulations, you've survived the weevil-infested hardtack, the musical stylings of drunken pirates, and the questionable hygiene of your fellow shipmates. Now it's time for the main event. The reason you signed up for this floating madhouse in the first place. Battle, or, as pirates called it, Tuesday. If you imagined naval combat as a series of noble salutes, coordinated cannon blasts, and the occasional dramatic monologue, you might want to recalibrate. Pirate warfare was less master and commander, and more bar brawl on a trampoline with explosives. It was dirty, fast, up close, and incredibly loud. If there was a strategy, it was usually get to the loot before the other guy gets to your spleen. Let's start with the approach. Pirates didn't go in waving flags and announcing themselves. Surprise was the secret source of piracy. They'd fly a friendly flag, British, French, Dutch, whatever fit the narrative, and sidle up to an unsuspecting merchant ship like they were dropping off muffins. Then, at the last second, up went the Jolly Roger, or the even scarier, red flag. Translation: we're not here to negotiate. And all hell would promptly break loose. The moment combat began, it was pure chaos. Cannon fire was typically the first move, a thunderous attempt to blow a hole in the enemy's hull, or, at the very least, shatter some nerves and wooden planks. Pirate cannons weren't precisely calibrated. They were more like loud, dangerous suggestions. Accuracy depended on the wind, the aim, the gunpowder, and whether the guy lighting the fuse had both eyes open. Sometimes the cannonball missed entirely. Sometimes it hit the water. Sometimes, if the ship was truly cursed, it backfired and took out a chunk of the pirate's own deck. That's what we call a tactical whoopsie. Cannonballs came in delightful varieties. There was your basic round shot, classic, reliable, does what it says on the tin. Then there was chain shot, 2 cannonballs connected by a chain, designed to mangle masts and rigging like a particularly angry blender. And if you were feeling especially nasty, you could load your cannon with scrap metal, rocks, or glass, turning it into an airborne garbage disposal. But pirates didn't rely on cannons for long-range duels. Oh no. Their ships were small and nimble, perfect for getting up close and personal, like a surprise hug with a dagger in it. The goal wasn't to sink the ship. That would be like burning down a bank before robbing it. Pirates wanted the loot, the cargo, and maybe some decorative throw pillows. So after a few rounds of cannon fire, it was time to board. Grappling hooks flew, planks were extended, or just jumped across, and suddenly it was melee central. Picture a swarm of angry, underwashed lunatics leaping onto your ship with cutlasses, flintlocks, axes, and the kind of energy usually reserved for angry toddlers. Screaming was a big part of the strategy. The louder you were, the more terrifying you seemed. Also, pirates weren't exactly professionals when it came to formations. It was more, everyone charge, unless you flank right. Weapons varied. You had your cutlass, the pirate's sword of choice. Short, curved, excellent for slashing in tight quarters. You had boarding axes, great for both combat and chopping through doors. Pistols were one-shot affairs, often fired, and then used as blunt objects. And sometimes a pirate would go in with nothing but a dagger and a really bad attitude. Amid the chaos, there was one objective: loot. That meant coins, spices, silk, wine, barrels of anything remotely valuable, and yes, fancy hats. If the enemy captain had a particularly extravagant hat with feathers, lace, or a shiny buckle, that hat became a top-tier trophy. Pirates were, if nothing else, fashion-conscious kleptomaniacs. But even pirates had lines they usually wouldn't cross. Killing everyone was bad for business. Dead men tell no tales. And they definitely don't surrender passwords to locked treasure chests. Most pirate crews preferred to intimidate, overwhelm, and offer a quick surrender option. Resistance was met with enthusiastic stabbing, but compliance might earn you your life, and maybe a job offer. Once the ship was secured and the loot collected, the crew partied like they'd just won the lottery, and immediately lost the ticket. There was shouting, dancing, and rum. So much rum. But even in victory, there was cleanup to handle. Fires needed putting out. Wounded pirates needed yelling at. And sometimes, your own deck had a few new holes that didn't come standard. And what if things went badly? If the enemy ship had more firepower, more manpower, or just better luck, pirates had to retreat fast. This often meant dumping stolen cargo overboard to lighten the load, or tossing a few crewmates who annoyed the captain. Desperate times, desperate cannonball dodging measures. In the end, piracy wasn't just about sailing. It was about fighting for what wasn't yours, and making it yours through noise, speed, and some truly absurd levels of confidence. Naval combat pirate style was never clean, rarely elegant, but almost always effective, or at least memorable. So you've survived a full-blown naval brawl, climbed aboard a smoking enemy deck, screamed like a lunatic, and now stand gloriously victorious with sweat in your eyes, someone else's blood on your boots, and a parrot biting your earlobe. What next? Time to talk business. Welcome to the Pirate Payday, a wild and surprisingly democratic process where loot got split, friendships got tested, and knives got nervously fondled. Unlike the rigid class systems of navy ships or merchant vessels, pirate crews had a strong sense of fairness, by which we mean everyone gets paid, and if you try to cheat me, I'll learn where your hammock is. Let's start with the pirate code. Yes, the very same set of semi-official rules that governed life aboard the ship, and helped keep the chaos from becoming complete anarchy. Most ships had their own slightly different version, but when it came to dividing treasure, the basic system was astonishingly well thought out. It wasn't just a free-for-all where everyone dove into a treasure chest and fought over who got the least moldy coin. This was structured looting, people. Here's how it worked. Every pirate had a share. Captains typically got 1.5 or 2 shares, enough to show leadership had perks, but not enough to make them an overlord. The quartermaster, who basically played pirate CFO and enforcer of fairness, also got a slightly boosted share. But your average sailor? He got a full share, equal among the rest of the scurvy mob. Even the guy who only cleaned the cannons or yelled particularly well in battle got his cut. That's more workplace equality than most 21st century startups. Now some folks earned extra loot based on injury. Think of it as a very medieval workers' comp program, except with less paperwork and more grog. Lose a leg in battle? Congratulations. Here's a bag of silver. An arm? That's worth even more. An eye? Also payable in coin. It wasn't out of kindness. It was an incentive to fight hard and not worry too much about whether your limbs came back with you. Some pirate codes even outlined exact amounts. 100 pieces of 8 for a lost limb, 600 for total disability, and a bonus parrot for enthusiasm. Okay, maybe not the last one. Of course, injury payouts meant someone was in charge of valuing the loot, and this was where things got spicy. Most treasure wasn't the classic X marks the spot, chest full of gold doubloons and glittering necklaces. Sure, sometimes you hit the jackpot with silver or jewels, but more often than not, the real profit came from the boring stuff. Spices, medicine, cloth, sugar, rum, and barrels of tobacco. All highly valuable, all very tradable, and none of it glittered enough to be worth getting stabbed in the sorting line. Sometimes pirates stole livestock, which they'd either sell or eat. They raided surgical supplies, which sounds dull until you remember how often pirate life required unscheduled surgery. They even stole manuscripts, navigational tools, and fancy wigs, if they were fashionable enough. You never knew what might sell in the next port. Some pirates probably retired on nothing but cinnamon and opium. And then there was the less dignified loot. Personal belongings, underwear, silk stockings, toothpicks, made from ivory. If you could take it, someone wanted it. That's how one pirate might end up with a jeweled snuff box, while another had to explain why he's now the proud owner of a crate full of someone else's boots. There's no HR department on a pirate ship. If it's not nailed down, it's fair game. Now, despite the fairish structure, this wasn't exactly a utopia of mutual respect. Things could, and often did, go sideways. Say the captain tried to skim a little extra off the top. The crew might notice, especially if someone got a suspiciously small pile of coins, while the captain was suddenly rocking a new gold-plated mug and an ostrich feather in his hat. That's when democracy gave way to mutiny or accidental sword wounds in the night. And if there were disputes about dividing the loot, and oh, there always were, they didn't exactly break out the spreadsheets and accountants. Usually, the quartermaster would try to smooth things over. If that failed, it could lead to duels, fistfights, or someone getting marooned on a conveniently empty island with a dramatic sigh and one last bottle of rum. There were also times when the loot went straight back into the ship's operational budget. Ships needed repairs, sails needed replacing, and rum wasn't free. Sometimes pirates even paid for bribes at corrupt ports to look the other way while they unloaded their loot. Yes, even pirates had overhead. Ultimately, though, this system kept things surprisingly stable. Pirates weren't just greedy thieves. They were greedy thieves with an internal revenue service made of sweaty men with cutlasses. It kept the crew loyal, the captain in check, and the knives out of everyone's backs, most of the time. So you thought being a pirate meant total freedom. No rules, no boss, no bedtime. Just endless rum and lawless plundering. Think again, you rascal. Pirate ships weren't anarchic booze cruises. They were floating courtrooms, powered by wind gunpowder, and the constant threat of being tied to a mast by your own shoelaces. Because when it came to pirate justice, things got creative. Let's start with the sacred pirate code. Every crew had one, a unique set of guidelines, scribbled down at the start of each voyage, and agreed upon with much drinking, and at least one guy already asleep. These weren't just ceremonial scrolls rolled up in dusty bottles. They were binding contracts. Break the code, and you didn't just get a stern look, you got punished. Dramatically. Stealing from a crewmate. That was the big one. Forget looting a royal convoy, or sinking a navy frigate, those were expected. But swipe another pirate's dagger, coins or gods help you, his last mouldy biscuit, and you were basically dead man limping. In a society built on shaky trust and shared treasure, theft among shipmates was unforgivable. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a direct threat to the ship's fragile unity. So, what happened if you crossed the line? Welcome to pirate punishment, a spectrum ranging from unpleasant to told ghost stories about you afterward. First up, lashes. The quartermaster, who we'll get to in a moment, would supervise flogging sessions using a cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip designed for maximum misery. 10 lashes, you'd be sore. 50, you might not get back up. Pirates wore their scars like medals, but only if they survived. Then there was the ultimate pirate nightmare, keel hauling. This involved tying you with rope, chucking you overboard, and dragging you under the ship's hull, back and forth, until you were either dead, missing your skin, or strongly reconsidering your life choices. Barnacles don't sound dangerous until they're peeling you like a soggy carrot. This punishment wasn't common, because ships needed sailors alive, but just knowing it was on the menu kept most pirates in line. And if your crime was betrayal, mutiny, or just really bad vibes, you might find yourself marooned. That meant being dropped off on a random deserted island with nothing but a musket, a bottle of water, and maybe a sarcastic wave goodbye. If the crew liked you, they might throw in a hat. Pirates loved hats. Now, not every disagreement called for torture or desert exile. Pirates had a more refined option for interpersonal drama. Duels. Let's say you insulted someone's parrot, accused them of cheating at dice, or, again, stole their biscuit. Instead of harboring passive-aggressive rage, you'd challenge them to a duel. These weren't elegant affairs with powdered wigs and 10 paces. Pirate duels were usually short, angry, and filled with enough yelling to confuse nearby seagulls. Swords were common, pistols if you had any left that weren't rusted or accidentally discharged into your foot. More often than not, these battles looked like two toddlers with cutlasses trying to outswear each other. But duels did serve a purpose. They let the steam out of the kettle before someone got murdered in their sleep. Now, let's talk about the man behind the whip, and most of the terrifying authority, the quartermaster. He wasn't just in charge of dividing loot or choosing hammocks. He was the judicial arm of pirate society, which sounds a lot less fun than guy who decides who gets rum, but was far more important. The quartermaster enforced the code, settled disputes, and basically played pirate HR. If your HR rep carried a dagger and had a tendency to vote for marooning people who didn't clean their mess kits, he had the power to overrule the captain in matters of discipline, and the crew could even appeal to him when they felt wronged. It was a built-in system of checks and bruises, and just to be clear, captains couldn't punish someone on a whim. If Captain Fancy Hat decided Barry was annoying and wanted to toss him overboard, he couldn't. The crew had to agree, often by vote, and the quartermaster had to bless the judgment. That balance kept the ship from becoming a floating dictatorship, at least on good days. But pirate justice wasn't always bloody or dramatic. Sometimes it was petty. Minor offences, like snoring too loud, hogging the grog, or singing sea shanties in the wrong key, might earn you a dunk in the sea, a day on deck duty in the sun, or being tied to the mast while everyone else got seconds. Passive-aggressive? Sure. Effective? Also yes. And while justice could be brutal, it worked. Ships stayed relatively orderly. Loot got divided. Backstabbing was discouraged, and everyone knew the rules, because those who didn't were either bleeding, floating, or talking to volleyballs on an island. So next time you think pirates were just chaotic rogues with zero structure, remember this. They had HR, he just carried a whip, and didn't do performance reviews, unless you count how loud your scream was during the lashings. Retirement plan? Easy, get rich, get lost, and never sneeze near the Royal Navy. So you've pillaged, plundered, and somehow avoided stabbing Carl during a heated parrot naming debate. But alas, even the most fearsome pirate must eventually face the unshaven beard of fate, because while pirate life was thrilling, the exit strategy left a lot to be desired. First off, let's clear up a myth. Pirates didn't exactly get gold watches and farewell parties. The most common way a pirate career ended was with a short drop and a sudden stop, aka hanging. And not the quick, neck-snapping kind either. We're talking public, slow, audience participation level executions. The Royal Navy and local authorities loved putting pirates on display, like grotesque warning signs. Come for the market day, stay for the swaying corpse, was basically the tourism slogan in parts of 18th century Port Royal. When captured, pirates were shackled, tried, and sentenced in grand courts, where they usually made a last-minute attempt to look pitiful and regretful, sometimes dressed in their finest, which might have still had blood or soup stains depending on recent raids. These pirate trials were more theatre than justice. The prosecution would rattle off accusations like they were reading a shopping list of sins. The defense, usually some muttered denial and a hopeful shrug. Unless the pirate had charm or a good story, then the court might get a memorable monologue before sentencing. And that sentencing, more often than not, it ended with a noose. Pirates were hanged at places like Execution Dock in London, where tides would wash over their dangling feet, symbolically claiming them for the sea, one last time. For particularly notorious rogues, their corpses were tarred and hung in cages, left to rot as a very smelly civic reminder that piracy, while profitable, had terrible retirement benefits. But not every pirate ended up feeding the gulls. Some took the smarter route, accepting a royal pardon. In times of political inconvenience, reared too many pirates making the colonies nervous, governments would hand out amnesty like candy at a cursed Halloween party. Promise to stop pillaging. You're free to go. They hoped this would reduce pirate numbers, and to be fair, some pirates did take the deal, especially when they were tired, rich, and possibly missing an eye or two. After being pardoned, these ex-pirates often tried going legit. Some became tavern owners, finally getting to serve rum instead of spilling it. Others opened shops, took up farming, or got into shipping, essentially switching teams to chase profits above board. A few even became governors or naval officers, like Wooders Rogers, who started as a privateer and ended up fighting the very pirates he used to hang out with. There were also the mysterious disappearances, the ones who just vanished. Maybe they settled down on a quiet island with their loot and a new name like Mr. Definitely not Blackbeard. Maybe they were eaten by sharks. History is fuzzy like that. One day you're Edward Teach, scourge of the sea. Next day, Hector Peabody, pineapple farmer. And of course, there were the rare unicorns of piracy, the ones who somehow retired rich. These were the strategic plunderers who quit while ahead, buried, or better yet, spent their treasure and disappeared into the world's underbelly. They avoided warships, bribed officials, and lived by the cardinal rule of pirate retirement. Don't get cocky and come back for one last job. But let's not forget the real legacy. Pirates may have been criminals, but they became legends. The image we have today of flamboyant swashbucklers with talking parrots and a heart of gold owes more to Hollywood than history. Real pirates smelled worse, lived shorter, and had more dental problems than even the grumpiest sea lion. But the fantasy endured. Books like Treasure Island and movies like Pirates of the Caribbean turned sea bandits into beloved anti-heroes, returned trial transcripts into bedtime stories, executions into action scenes, and the endless hunt for loot into a romantic metaphor. Never mind that most pirates were likely half-starved, semi-drunk lunatics with a gambling problem, and lice colonies so large they needed names. Still, we remember them not just for their crimes, but for the audacity of their freedom. In a world of rigid hierarchy and strict rules, pirates made their own code, voted for their leaders, and created their own bizarre democracy, one where the punishment for stealing was a duel, and the pension plan was a hook for a hand. So what was the true pirate retirement plan? Simple, plunder enough to never need to work again. Get out fast, before the Royal Navy notices you've sunk a dozen merchant ships. Rebrand completely. New name, new life. Preferably somewhere warm and far from rope dealers. Tell no one where the treasure is buried, not even Barry, especially not Barry. And if you did all that right, you might just spend your twilight years sipping rum, toasting your former crew, and occasionally scaring tourists with stories that might be true.